from the devolved nations, let alone other colleagues, it would be a difficult charge to land to suggest that they haven't been closely involved with the process right from the beginning. And I suspect his comments are really based on the fact that he doesn't like the reality of what's going on rather than has a legitimate comment to make.
First of two questions, Liz Saville-Roberts.
Last week it was revealed that his government had actively sought to conceal information from the Welsh Government. This information included the likelihood of food shortages and their intention to grab new powers. This doesn't sound like intergovernmental parity of esteem. As Secretary of State for Wales, where does his role to represent the Tory party in Wales stop and his role to build trust and mutual respect start?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the first responsibility in this particular context is to respect the fact that 55% of people in Wales voted to leave the European Union. And it seems to me astonishing that the party of Wales, represented by the Honourable Lady, is still so out of step with the people of Wales when it comes to that. The clock is not being turned back, and what we're attempting to do is to deliver a deal which respects that decision and all of the institutions in Wales, which I thought we both valued.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Our trust, I think, in politicians is sadly diminishing at this time because politicians are not seen to answer the question at hand. But back to the matter of trust. Transmission rates indicate that Wales stands on the brink of a circuit breaker announcement. Businesses in Wales and people who need to self-isolate seek assurance that they can trust the Treasury to back up COVID-19 control measures made in Wales for Wales. Can he guarantee the people of Wales that they can indeed trust his government to do this?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, having seen the Chancellor ensure that Welsh Government has had £4.4 billion worth of UK taxpayers' money for exactly this purpose, I hope that she would actually share my view that we are looking at the UK in the round. This is an international problem, COVID. It doesn't respect political boundaries, and the Chancellor's announcement make it very clear that he sees all of the UK as a priority, not just individual component parts, and I would think the numbers speak for themselves.
For withdrawn, Simon Baines.
Question number 5, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, we have, of course, worked hand in hand with the Welsh Government throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. The Secretary of State for Wales, myself, have regular discussions with Welsh ministers about the ongoing UK-wide response to COVID-19, and those include discussions between the Secretary of State, the First Minister, and, of course, meetings between the UK Government and all devolved institutions.
Simon Baines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Restricting the virus is vital, but the Welsh Government's lockdown measures in Clwyd South and the rest of North Wales need reviewing, given the difficulties they are causing, particularly for hospitality, wedding industry and leisure businesses, by using county boundaries rather than being targeted on the specific areas with high COVID case numbers. Would the Minister be able to outline how often the Welsh Government has invited the UK Government to participate in their COVID-19 planning meetings, and whether they have discussed using more detailed evidence by community rather than just by county?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that is a very good question, because, of course, whilst the UK Government extends an open invitation to the devolved administrations to take part in COBRA meetings and ministerial implementation groups, the same spirit of cooperation has not thus far been forthcoming. I was invited to one meeting by the Welsh Government ministers, but only to discuss the parts that were reserved anyway for the UK Government. So we stand ready to accept the same level of cooperation from Welsh Government that we have always extended to them in the UK Government.
Shadow Minister Gerald Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With cases rising across the UK, the First Minister has called for an extraordinary meeting of COBRA to discuss plans for a so-called circuit break lockdown. The measures are already under active consideration in Wales and will be implemented by Welsh Government if they need to be. But of course, any such measures work well and are more effective if we take them as a four-nation approach when applied across the whole of the UK. So will the government now listen to its own scientific advisers and to those of us on these benches and agree to meet with devolved nations to discuss these specific proposals?
Mr. Speaker, throughout this pandemic, the government have listened to a wide range of scientific advisers. Some of them will be advising circuit breakers, others will be suggesting that, that measures are too strict. The government have listened to all, have tried to steer a course through the middle of this. They've listened to Welsh Government ministers on numerous occasions. Over 100 such meetings have taken place, and will continue to listen with an open mind and to follow the evidence.
Anna McMorran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, unlike this Tory government in England, our Labour government in Wales does follow the science. The rules in Wales stop people from taking the virus with them from high to low prevalence areas, protecting people's lives. We want the same for visitors to Wales from across the rest of the UK where rates are even higher. So why is it that this Tory government is ignoring the First Minister yet again, failing to stand up for the people of Wales, playing politics with people's lives?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we certainly aren't playing politics with people's lives. But the Honourable Lady will surely be aware that 25% of the workforce of Wales actually travel over to England to work there. And playing politics with people's lives potentially means looking at livelihoods as well. The reality is that we have followed the science all the way through this process, and more or less the Welsh Government have followed exactly what the UK Government are doing.
Rob Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Lady says that we should follow the science. Well, 10 minutes ago, Public Health Wales told me that they didn't even carry out a community-level analysis prior to instigating these lockdown measures. So would my honourable friend agree with me that this virus doesn't respect county borders, and once again that all the Labour Welsh Government is doing is throttling businesses and letting down the people of North Wales?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I firstly wish my honourable friend Penbloith Happis tomorrow and say that it is the case, of course, that this virus doesn't respect boundaries, but the UK Government does respect boundaries, and whilst I fully accept that some people may have concerns about the slightly different approach that the Welsh Government sometimes adopts in this matter, the UK Government respects devolution, respects the reality of Welsh Government, and my role as a minister is to work constructively with Welsh Government ministers. I don't, at this moment, wish to start playing politics and criticising them.
Number 8, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Chief Secretary of Treasury wrote to the Honourable Member last week to confirm he's expecting to provide £2.5 million needed for the tip repairs in Tylerstown and his constituency. The letter also clarifies he is waiting to hear further from Welsh Government on additional request to access the reserve.
Well, that was useless, yet again. It's been months now that I've been asking for the money for the Rhondda. The Prime Minister wrote to me in June saying that he recognised that Wales had been particularly badly hit by Storm Dennis and that the UK Government would look seriously at any requests for funding. I'm delighted we've got the £2.5 million for the Tylerstown tip, but frankly we need £60 million to mend culverts, drains, make people's houses secure, both in Pontypridd and in the Rhondda and across the whole of RCT. Make sure you earn your money by getting us our money in the Rhondda.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What a contrast to the conversation we had last week when I reported this news, and where he was charm and diplomacy itself, and yet when he gets into the chamber with an audience, he becomes a different personality. But I will remind him, just in case he forgot, what the Chief Secretary's letter actually says. Amongst other things, I'm expecting to provide required funding. That's in relation to the Welsh Government confirming it will make a reserve claim for 2020-2021. And so this process is underway. It does require Welsh Government to come to the party too. It hasn't done so yet, and of course a lot of this is in a devolved space, so we can't just pick and choose which bits of devolution suit his particular desire to make a statement in the chamber.
Tony Antoniazzi.
Question 9, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will answer questions 9 and 10 together. I have regular discussions with the Chancellor, and we spoke only last week. The Chancellor has since announced a significant package of further job support and an additional £400 million of funding for Welsh Government, totalling 4.4.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tourism and hospitality is the backbone of the economy of the Gower Peninsula. My constituent Lara Jocelyn runs the King's Head in Llangennith. She is fighting to keep her family business alive. Lara runs a popular rural pub and accommodation, and like many others in Gower, this provides vital part-time jobs to local people. Why is the Secretary of State not banging on the door of the Treasury to right the wrong of the job support scheme to support independent hospitality businesses like Lara's?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady and I have similar dependence on tourism in our particular constituencies, so I understand absolutely the argument she's making about its value. But I will remind her that so far the UK taxpayers have contributed £1.1 billion by way of bounce-back loans, 490 million self-employed income support, 303 million coronavirus business interruption, £13 million worth of eat out, help out, future funding 7 million. I would carry on, Mr. Speaker, if only you would let me. That's not to mention 401,000 employees on furlough too. The Treasury has gone above and beyond the international average in trying to get to every single business in every single area of the UK, and that includes Gower just as much as it does anywhere else.
Come on.
Mr. Speaker, for those who are able to access the government's new job support scheme, and many are locked out or deemed by the government to be in unviable jobs, a cut of a third of the wages for the low paid makes it extremely hard to pay bills and feed families. Does the Secretary of State really get this? And if so, will Welsh Office Ministers fight to get a better scheme?
Thank you, Ms. Speaker. We've often in this question session talked about the fact that there will always be those in all of our constituencies who don't quite fit every single one of the intervention measures that the Chancellor has announced over the last few months. In those circumstances, of course, we want to be as flexible as possible. Of course, we want to try and find ways, either through the intervention schemes or through universal credit, to support the hardest hit families as best we can. And where there are individual examples of those gaps, then of course, if she brings them to my attention, I will do my best to address them.
Secretary of State Neil Griffith with the first of two questions.
Mr. Speaker, well, throughout this pandemic, Welsh businesses have done all that they can to stay open and stay trading, with so many drawing on the support grants and loans that have been so important in keeping them afloat. But as more areas of the country come under local restrictions, with trading halted or severely limited, and fears about public confidence, many businesses feel that they've absolutely maxed out on their borrowing and are worried about the future. So what plan does the government have to support these businesses that are now heavily in debt, to make sure that the burden of repayments in the coming months does not mean that they go under?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start really by expressing some confusion that on the one hand, members opposite are articulating a Welsh Government view that the existing interventions aren't strict enough, and then the Honourable Lady gets to her feet and says actually they're almost imposing undue hardship. So it's quite difficult to know exactly where they do stand on these getting a balance right between disease control and maintaining a vibrant economy. However, what I would say to her is that at each and every stage of this process, the Chancellor has been flexible and adaptable, recognised that the situation is changing often by the hour, let alone by the day or week. And the financial interventions, which up till now have been about £4.4 billion by way of barnetised contribution to Welsh Government, and you could probably double that for the other interventions which are more direct, those are the measures which we think have supported business in Wales up till now. But of course, as the circumstances change and our reaction change, so we will remain flexible.
And indeed, Mr. Speaker, we have always said that any restrictions need to be backed up with proper financial support measures for business. But to reduce the spread of the virus, it's vital also that workers who are unwell or asked to self-isolate do actually stay off work. But as hours are reduced in sectors like hospitality, an increasing number of Welsh workers will find themselves falling below the minimum weekly earnings threshold needed to qualify for statutory sick pay. To expect them to live off nothing for a fortnight is totally unacceptable. Will the Secretary of State urge the Chancellor to do the decent thing and to extend the statutory sick pay scheme to all workers?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know from my sort of personal contact with the Chancellor over the last few weeks that he's looking at all of these particular options. That's why the winter resilience measures were brought in a week or so ago, on top of all of the other measures which he has introduced, and which recognise the very difficult situation so many people find themselves in. So, of course, you know, I'm not going to stand here and say we're never going to consider another option. Of course we will. We will always look at the individual circumstances, particularly of those who are hardest hit.
Let's head to Wales with Howell Williams. Howell Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to our recent meeting with various COVID funding measures being announced by his governments, sometimes seemingly haphazardly, and causing some confusion. A bit for football here, a bit for the arts there. And now apparently pays funding for universities in Wales, even though this matter is devolved. With all that happening, will he consider publishing a regular, simple table of government's COVID funding and the consequential amounts for Wales, if there are such?
Honourable Gentleman makes a good point about universities. Of course, it is devolved and yet hugely dependent on the union effort. But in answer to his very direct question, I can give him a very direct yes.
With 14 withdrawn, Andrew Griffith.
Question number 15, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I'm committed to driving forward each of the growth deals in Wales, and since March have taken part in 24 meetings with representatives of Wales city and growth deals. I recently visited Carmarthen West and South Pembrokeshire constituency after approving the Pembroke Dock Marine Development, one of the many growth deal projects which will be contributing to levelling up in Wales.
The Prime Minister last week outlined how we can build back better by investing in areas like hydrogen, green energy and electric mobility. Does he agree with me that it's an opportunity for the whole United Kingdom, but particularly to put Wales at the heart of that green revolution?
Very happy to agree with that question, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister's commitment last week was a game changer, quadrupling offshore wind energy by 2030, doubling the amount of support for renewables projects, £160 million support in infrastructure and 1 gigawatt of new floating wind projects. This is all the clear evidence of this government's commitment to a green and resilient economic recovery from the coronavirus.
Rumball.
16, sir.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, the UK Internal Market Bill will protect seamless trade across the United Kingdom, something that will benefit people in all corners of the UK and indeed of this House. Our market access guarantee will provide certainty for Welsh businesses as the transition period ends and provide a firm foundation upon which businesses may flourish.
Rumball.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank the Minister for his answer. Obviously, in Newcastle-under-Lyme, the whole of Staffordshire, indeed the whole of the West Midlands, there are a number of businesses that both source and supply from Wales. These businesses need the certainty that standards will be observed and that what they produce will be able to be sold into different markets around the United Kingdom and particularly in Wales. Will you confirm that the UK Internal Market Bill will deliver on that?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I can absolutely confirm that. I hope all members of this House are listening to the wise words from the Honourable Gentleman. The bill provides a vital guarantee that businesses in his constituency and in all constituencies across the UK will be able to continue to trade confidently within our internal market as the transition period ends.
John Morrison.
Number 17, Mr Speaker.
Secretary Hart.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. UK Government has provided a support package to Welsh businesses and communities in recent weeks, including the Government's £30 billion plan for jobs. Our ambition remains to secure jobs, stimulate growth and provide opportunities to level up Wales.
John Morrison.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. May I thank the Minister for his financial support for Wales and for the devolved Welsh Government. My question is, what if the Welsh Government want to trigger further restrictions, does my right honourable friend agree that if the Welsh Government wants to go beyond government measures, which measures should ultimately be a source of last resort, then it needs to provide plans for how it will financially support the industries that will be hit as a result?
Secretary Hart.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Honourable Lady makes a very good point, and I think that the Barnettised numbers totalling £4.4 billion so far do give Welsh Government a degree of flexibility in addressing issues if the evidence supports it in a slightly different way. And there are one or two examples of where they have introduced their own interventions courtesy of money provided by UK taxpayers. But the overriding point is that there does need to be a degree of collaboration, cooperation, which straddles all of the countries of the UK, because this is an international and a national challenge.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Like me, the Secretary of State would have welcomed the vision set out by the Prime Minister last week for expanding renewable energy and, importantly, that commitment to boosting floating offshore wind power, which represents such a big opportunity for us in Wales. So can I ask my right honourable friend if he would use his good offices to make sure now that all of the relevant players in this, the private sector developers who've got projects ready to go, Bays, the Crown Estate, which of course owns the seabed, are all on the same page working towards a shared goal so that we get decisions made in a timely way?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, absolutely. I agree with my right honourable friends and neighbours' assessment of the situation, and we were all encouraged by the Minister's comments just now in that respect. I hope, encourage him by saying I'm meeting the Crown Estate the day after tomorrow, I think it is, to discuss the potential delays, which at the moment look like being their problem, and we need to unblock that.
Come to question 19. It's a substantive to Secretary Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Frequent discussions with the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. At least 510,000 people in Wales have been directly supported by the measures we have so far put in place. However, of course, the best possible support we can provide is to get behind the national effort and public health guidelines to ensure we overcome this crisis sooner rather than later.
Let's head up to Lancashire with Rosie Cooper. Rosie Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the UK's unemployment rate at its highest level in 3 years, it's clear that many workers in Wales will need to rely on social security in order to get back on the feet. Does the Secretary of State agree that it's only fair to update legacy benefits such as job seekers allowance and employment support allowance to match the increase in universal credit that was announced earlier this year?
Thank you, Honourable Lady, for her comments. And of course, conversations I've had with the DWP and indeed the Chancellor have touched on this very issue, which is why the arrangements as far as universal credit have been as flexible as they can. The effort by the Department to make sure everybody is accounted for and those who might fall into the gaps we referred to earlier on are properly looked after. That is very much uppermost in the minds of Cabinet and ministerial colleagues, and I can give her that assurance.
We now have substantive to Minister Davis from Jamie Stone. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the government are committed to a record to rolling out broadband across the United Kingdom, although we have much work to do. I'm pleased that 15% of premises in Wales have access to full fibre broadband, compared to only 14% in the UK as a whole. And only a fortnight ago, I was able to go out with an innovative Welsh SME, Beacons Telecom, who are helping to deliver broadband in remote and rural parts of Wales, the parts of Wales that Openreach seemingly cannot reach.
We've now got Scotland with Jamie Stone. Jamie Stone.
Mr. Speaker, I suspect that my question will come as no surprise to you. I represent one of the most remote parts of the UK, and far too many of my constituents simply cannot get decent connectivity. Could the Minister please share his experience and his know-how with the Scottish Government so that we can get this problem sorted out?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, if the Scottish Government care to issue me an invitation, I stand ready to serve and offer advice such as I can. But actually, I think my advice is that there are innovative small companies out there who are able to do things that Openreach apparently can't do. And I saw an example of it in Wales. I'm sure there must be many others. But can I assure the honourable gentleman that as one who is committed to the Union, our broadband ambitions span not just Wales, but the whole of the United Kingdom, from the tip of Penzance right up to the coast of Caithness and beyond.
Go longer.
Number 21, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will answer questions 21 and 22 together. The Government is fully committed to the constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom. Our response to the COVID-19 outbreak has clearly demonstrated the value of Wales being a part of the Union, with a package of UK Government support that frankly goes well beyond anything which the Welsh Government could offer alone. It is clear that our four nations are safer and more prosperous when we stand together.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is very good news that the Government has appointed Sir Peter to undertake a detailed review into how the quality and availability of transport infrastructure can support economic growth across the UK, as well as the quality of life across the UK. Will the Minister advise what his department's priorities are for this review in Wales?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, our priorities clearly will be better transport links, ensuring that Wales is better connected to the rest of the Union. But the ambitions for the Government go well beyond transport infrastructure. We believe that Wales is an integral part of the United Kingdom, and we want to see not just good transport links, but our historical links, our cultural links, because we believe that one is quite easily able to be proud to be Welsh and proud to be British in this union.
Final question from Selene Saxby in Devon. Selene Saxby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. From Ilfracombe to Exmoor in my North Devon constituency, you can see South Wales. Does my honourable friend agree that we should look at the options for better connecting these two areas to strengthen the links between our economies and ultimately the Union?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I entirely agree with what the Honourable Lady has said. This government is going to strengthen all links within the United Kingdom. We are a Conservative and Unionist government, and I look forward to support on all sides of the House. Thank you.
Before Prime Minister's question time, I wish to make a short statement. On Monday, in an answer to a question from the Honourable Member for Swansea West about the virtual participation in debates, the Prime Minister said, inadvertently I would accept, I defer to you and the House authorities. As the Prime Minister will know, decisions on the scope of virtual participation are for the House itself. All decisions are being made on that basis of motions moved by the Leader of the House. I know that the House of Common Service will be more than happy to facilitate virtual participation in debates if the House voted for it. And if the Government wished to pass me the power, I'm more than happy to accept it. But the decision to bring forward the relevant motion is a matter for the Prime Minister and the Government he leads, not for me and the House authorities. Right, let us get underway, Prime Minister. Shelley's for her. Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Mr Shelley's for her.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. During this pandemic, in my constituency of North West Cambridgeshire, I have seen a number of instances of ordinary citizens doing extraordinary work, helping the elderly and the vulnerable. And that has been repeated across the country in every single constituency, giving true meaning to the words community spirit. Would my right honourable friend take this opportunity not only to acknowledge this fantastic work that has been done by so many people, but also to give a huge thank you to each and every one of these unsung heroes of our country?
I thoroughly concur with my right honourable friend, and I congratulate all the volunteers for the spirit and the achievements that they have delivered for the people of this country. And I was delighted that we had a first chance to honour them in the birthday honours list of the weekend, or just some of them.
Let's come to the Leader of the Opposition, Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On the 11th of May, the Prime Minister said that the government's COVID strategy, and I quote him, will be governed entirely by the science. On the 21st of September, the government's own scientific advisers, SAGE, gave very clear advice. They said a package of interventions, including a circuit breaker, will be needed to prevent an exponential rise in cases. Why did the Prime Minister reject that advice and abandon the science?
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, we will do whatever it takes to fight this virus and to defeat it. But since he quotes the SAGE advice, I might just remind him that on page 1 it says that all the interventions considered have associated costs in terms of health and well-being, and that policymakers will need to consider analysis of economic impacts and the associated harms alongside this epidemiological assessment. And the advice that I have today, Mr Speaker, is that if we do the regional approach that commended itself to the House and indeed to the right honourable gentleman on Monday, Mr Speaker, we can bring down the R and we can bring down the virus. So will he stick to his position of Monday and support that approach?
Keir Starmer.
I don't think that approach goes far enough, and neither does SAGE. And the Prime Minister talks of the costs. Since he rejected SAGE's advice on the 21st of September, I remind him, the R rate has gone up, the infection rate has quadrupled, hospital admissions have gone from 275 a day to 628 a day in England. Yesterday, 441 COVID patients were on ventilators, and the number of deaths recorded was tragically the highest since June the 10th. That's the cost of rejecting the advice. SAGE has a clear view on why that's happening. What's the Prime Minister's view on why these numbers are all heading in the wrong direction?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I set that out very clearly in the House on Monday, and the difference between this stage of the pandemic and March and April, as the House knows very well, is that the disease is appearing much more strongly in some parts of the country than in others. And in Liverpool, for instance, alas, the figures are now running at 670 cases per 100,000 against 33 cases per 100,000 in Cornwall. 540 cases per 100,000 in Newcastle, alas, against 32 in Norfolk. And that is why the tiered approach, the three-tiered approach that we set out on Monday and that he then supported, is the right way forward. And we want to put in the most stringent measures necessary in the places where the virus is surging in order to get it down where it is surging, Mr. Speaker. That is the logical thing to do. So will he get on to his Labour friends in those parts of the north of England where we want to work with them to put those very stringent measures in place in order to deliver the reductions that the whole country wants to see? Will he support those measures? Because he wouldn't support them last night, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Prime Minister's behind the curve again. He probably hasn't noticed that this morning the council leaders in Greater Manchester that he's just quoted, including the Mayor and including the Conservative leader of Bolton Council, have said in a press statement that they support a circuit break above Tier 3 restrictions. Keep up, Prime Minister. The big problem the Prime Minister has, and it's from the Sage minutes that make it absolutely clear that his two main policies, track and trace and local restrictions, simply haven't worked. And we can't stand by. In June, the Prime Minister told me that track and trace would play a vital part in ensuring that we do not have a second spike this winter. His words. 3 months later, Sage have concluded that track and trace, their words, is only having a marginal impact on transmission. They go on to say, and this is the really worrying part, that this is likely to further decline in the future. Further decline. So let's not have the usual nonsense that anyone asking the Prime Minister a question about track and trace is somehow knocking the NHS. This is Sage's assessment, the government's own advisers. So after £12 billion, let's have a straight answer. Why does the Prime Minister think that his track and trace system has gone so wrong?
Mr. Speaker, it is thanks to NHS Test and Trace that is now testing more people than any other country in Europe that we know where the disease is surging, and we know that it is regionally distributed rather than nationally distributed at the moment, and that gives us a chance now to do the right thing. He wants to close pubs, he wants to close bars, he wants to close businesses in areas across the country where the incidence is low, and that's what he wants to do, and he wants to do it now, and yet he voted to do nothing last night, nothing in the areas where the incidence is highest, Mr. Speaker. He says one thing at 5 o'clock about calling for a national lockdown. When it came to a vote in this House of Commons, Mr. Speaker, to impose more stringent measures, he failed even to turn up.
Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I know that for someone who's been an opportunist all his life, this is difficult to understand. But having read and considered the Sage advice, I have genuinely concluded that a circuit break is in the national interest. Genuinely concluded. Mr. Speaker, it's the failure of the Prime Minister's strategy that means tougher measures are now unavoidable. That's Sage's view. Sage has advised that a circuit breaker should act to reduce R below 1, should reset the incidence of disease to a lower level, and should set the epidemic back by approximately 28 days or more. All three are vital, and that's why Labour backs it. So can the Prime Minister tell us what is his alternative plan to get R below 1? R below 1.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the plan is the plan that the right honourable gentleman supported on Monday. And the whole point Mr. Speaker, is to seize this moment now to avoid the misery of another national lockdown into which he wants to go headlong by delivering a regional solution. And, Mr. Speaker, opportunism is, I'm afraid, the name of the game for the party opposite, because they backed the rule of six, or he backed the rule of six, and then refused to vote for it. I think at 3 o'clock, Mr. Speaker, the Shadow Health spokesman said that a national lockdown would be disastrous. At 5 o'clock, he was calling for it, Mr. Speaker. Let's go back to the approach that he was supporting on Monday. Let's try to avoid the misery of another national lockdown, which he would want to impose, as I say, in a headlong way. And let's work together. Let's work together, as he was prepared to do on Monday, to keep kids in school, who he would now yank out of school in a peremptory way, keep our economy going, and keep jobs and livelihoods supported in this country, Mr. Speaker, and let's take the commonsensical regional approach. And will he kindly spell out to all his colleagues across the whole of the country that that is the best way forward, as indeed he did on Monday?
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, following the advice is now apparently opportunistic. Presumably he'll say the same to the leader of Bolton Council, a Conservative leader, who this morning said he supports a circuit break. Mr. Speaker, I've just listened to what the Prime Minister said about his strategy to get R below 1. But I can't think of a single scientist who backs him. He will know that the Chief Medical Officer said on Monday that his words, Chief Medical Officer, not confident, nor is anyone confident, that the Tier 3 proposals for the highest rate would be enough. That's Tier 3. That's Tier 3, the highest tier. So why is the Prime Minister so confident that his approach will get the R rate below 1, so confident? Or is that no longer the government plan?
I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, he is misrepresenting the position. Doubtless inadvertently, what our advice is that if the regional measures at Tier 3 at all levels were implemented in full, with the support and the active cooperation of local leaders, as indeed we have seen from the leader of Liverpool City Region. I pay tribute to him and I thank him for what he is doing. If we saw full and proper enforcement, if they were able to conduct proper local test and trace with the support of the £500 million that we're giving, then yes, those measures would deliver, Mr. Speaker, the reduction in the R locally, regionally that we need in order to avert what none of us want to see, except now the Right Honourable Gentleman having performed this extraordinary U-turn, none of us want to see, and that is the disaster, the words of the Shadow Health spokesman, of a national lockdown. We don't want to go there. We want the regional approach. He should cooperate with it.
Keir Starmer.
Speaker, I've supported the government in all their measures so far, and I've taken criticism of it. But I think this measure is wrong, and a circuit breaker is in the national interest. I've read the advice of SAGE, and the government has rejected it. Mr. Speaker, this is my last question, and I'm sure the Prime Minister has his pre-prepared rant ready as usual. But we're at a tipping point. Time is running out. Maybe he can seize the moment and answer a question. This morning, the Telegraph quotes senior government sources saying the chances of the Prime Minister backing a circuit break in the next 2 weeks are about 80%. Is that right? And if it is, why doesn't he do it now, save lives, fix testing and protect the NHS?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is a right honourable gentleman who claims to be supporting the government one day and then performs a dramatic U-turn the next. Everybody, Mr. Speaker, he claims to support the rule of six one day, then pulls his support the next. He wants tough measures and then refuses to vote for them. Everybody, Mr. Speaker, can see what he's doing. Labour have said it themselves. They see this, Mr. Speaker, as a good crisis for the Labour Party and one they wish to exploit. We see this as a national crisis that we are going to turn around. And the way we're going to do it, Mr. Speaker, the way we're going to do it, and I rule out nothing, of course, in combating the virus. But we are going to do it with the local, the regional approach that can drive down and will drive down the virus if it is properly implemented. And that is what I believe he should be supporting. He said he'd support it on Monday, Mr. Speaker. This is our opportunity to keep things going, to keep our kids in school, to keep our businesses going. That, I think, is what the people of this country want to do. This is our opportunity to do that and to suppress the virus where it is surging. He refuses to accept that approach today. I hope that not for the first time, Mr. Speaker, he will change his mind and think the better of his actions.
Mr. Speaker, one of the great unsung achievements of the coalition government was the recruitment of 4,200 extra health visitors. Now, as an experienced father himself, the PM knows how vital baby-to-baby contact is, as well as support networks for new parents. Yet lockdown has made that difficult, and at a time when they are most needed, health visitor numbers have dwindled and they've been diverted from face-to-face contact. So will the Prime Minister urgently look at reversing the decline in health visitors and support the parent-infant premium proposal by the Parent-Infant Foundation to help lockdown babies catch up?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend, who's not only an experienced father himself, but also, of course, an experienced campaigner on this issue. And I'm very pleased that health visiting teams have continued throughout this crisis to prioritise vulnerable families, and that is what they're going to do throughout the winter and throughout the pandemic.
Let's head to Scotland with the leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the founder of Brewdog warned the end of the job retention scheme will lead to a tsunami of unemployment. Brewdog is just one of thousands of businesses across Scotland and the United Kingdom demanding that the Tory government U-turn on its reckless plans to scrap the furlough scheme. There are just 2 weeks left to save people's jobs and livelihoods. So, Prime Minister, in the next fortnight, you have two choices. Extend the full furlough scheme or inflict a tsunami of unemployment on our people this winter. What is the Prime Minister going to choose?
Minister.
Well, I thank the right honourable gentleman. As he knows, the Chancellor has already unveiled the job support system scheme, which will go through till next year. And for those on low incomes, they will also have the additional benefit of universal credit, which again is going through in its uplifted form, 1,000 extra per year through to next April, at least.
Ian Blackford.
My goodness, Mr. Speaker, that answer really does just show that the Prime Minister doesn't get it. Universal credit, is that really what the Prime Minister is saying to those that could be saved? People don't want to hear of these boasting and the excuses that we get. They want action. And these half measures don't cover it. Thousands have already lost their jobs. The ONS has confirmed the highest rate of redundancies since 2009. We're heading towards a Tory winter of mass unemployment created by the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. We know what the Prime Minister's Tory colleagues are saying. The Prime Minister's next job could be on the back benches. He just doesn't know it yet. If the Prime Minister won't U-turn on his plans to scrap furlough, does he realise he will never, not ever be forgiven for the damage he's just about to cause to people up and down Scotland?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I say, and I've said many times to the right honourable gentleman, this government is continuing to support people across the whole of the UK, many billions of pounds in Barnett consequentials, at least £5 billion in Barnett consequentials for Scotland alone. And but one thing I will congratulate him on is the Scottish Nationalist Party's support for the tiered approach, which I think is still their policy, Mr. Speaker. Unlike the party opposite, at least they're showing some vestige of consistency in their normal gelatinous behaviour.
Let's head over to Hendon with Dr. Matthew Offord. Dr. Matthew Offord.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, I met virtually with the Hendon Cladding Collective to discuss building safety. The EWS1 form was raised as this was designed to support residential valuation and lending on buildings over 18 metres. However, the consolidated advice notes issued by the Department for Housing, Communities and Local Government extended the scope of this form to buildings below 18 metres. Will the Prime Minister provide specific interim advice around risk prioritisation of buildings below 18 metres? And will he also extend the Building Safety Fund to buildings of less than 18 metres?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'll look at the second point that the honourable gentleman, my honourable friend, raises. But what I can tell him is that we're obviously focusing first on the buildings that are over 18 metres with unsafe cladding. But I understand that the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors is producing a risk matrix to support mortgage valuation under 18 metres, and led by the National Fire Chiefs Council, a risk prioritisation tool for blocks of flats will be available shortly.
Colin Eastman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. By the weekend, Northern Ireland will be in an effective lockdown. Under the Chancellor's new furlough scheme starting in November, a minimum wage full-time employee, a normal worker, would be entitled to £227 per week. I doubt this Prime Minister could survive on that. How in under God does he expect ordinary decent workers to survive on it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of what this government has done to raise the national living wage, which this government introduced. But what I can tell them is that whatever happens, a combination of the job support scheme and universal credit will mean that nobody gets less than 93% of their current income.
Mr. Speaker, my constituency of Anismore has the best nuclear site in the UK. Will the Prime Minister confirm to me and the people of Anismore that he is 100% behind Wilvanowith?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I congratulate her on her fantastic campaigning for a nuclear future for Anismore, and she has no more fervent supporter in that objective than me.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Community Secretary has a habit of hitting the headlines, not always for the right reason. At the weekend, we discovered that his constituency had been awarded £25 million for a regeneration scheme, and that was approved by one of his own ministers. The Secretary of State returned the favour by approving funding for that minister's constituency. We have one department, two ministers, and tens of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money. Does the Prime Minister think that this approval process is appropriate, or does he actually think that the public might be right in thinking this all looks a bit grubby?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, all this was independently approved, but if he has some serious allegation to make against my right honourable friend, then may I suggest that he has the guts to make it.
Craig Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, British wool is a multifunctional, versatile product, but sadly farmers across the UK and indeed Montgomeryshire feel frustrated that this highly sustainable natural product is not properly valued and utilised to its full potential at the moment. Can I ask the Prime Minister to help boost the export market, or indeed our domestic demand for British wool as we build back better? For example, use the wool as a great insulator for the next generation of sustainable housing.
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for what he does to campaign for wool, and as someone whose family used to farm sheep, I feel the pain of sheep farmers everywhere, wool farmers everywhere. The price is on the floor at the moment, Mr. Speaker. Uses such as the one my honourable friend identifies, I think are indeed extremely interesting and should be pursued, and I urge everybody in this country thinking of Christmas presents to buy British wool this winter.
Neil Coyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 weeks ago, the Prime Minister told me he would support charities to be able to open COVID-safe accommodation for homeless people this winter. But yesterday, the government announced a £3 million cut in the cold weather fund this year, despite higher COVID-related costs. Will the Prime Minister at least guarantee that all government funds can be used to cover anyone and everyone needing shelter?
Prime Minister.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, we will make sure that local authorities get the support that they need, and as he knows, we've already put an extra £3.7 billion into helping local authorities, and I think a total of £28 billion into tackling the local consequences of COVID, and we will continue to support people throughout the country.
Let's head to the southwest with Sigurry Street. Sigurry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. May I strongly support the aspiration of the Prime Minister set out last week to deliver floating offshore wind capacity of 1 gigawatt by 2030. Is my right honourable friend aware that there is a very substantial scheme being worked up in the Celtic Sea that would meet a third of this target, as well as creating many jobs in South Wales and Devon and Cornwall? Would he please use his best endeavours to ensure that the Crown Estate looks favourably upon this project to help our country deliver its important climate change commitments?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm aware of the incredible prospects in the Celtic Sea, and I'm confident that the Crown Estate, as the landlord of the seabed, will respond positively.
Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Luke Thomas has recently been diagnosed with terminal cancer. He urgently needs to move closer to his family for support. Luke has a shared ownership flat in a low-rise building with wooden cladding, but he can't sell it because mortgage lenders require an EWS1 certificate and Luke's building does not have one. Estimates suggest it could take 10 years to certify every building affected, but Luke and hundreds of thousands of people like him cannot wait that long. When will the Prime Minister end this scandal?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I direct the honourable lady to what I said just a moment or two ago to my honourable friend about trying to provide mortgage backing for those who find themselves in that very difficult position. But we must get on and remove the cladding, the flammable cladding from buildings of all kinds.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ashfield and Eastwood has been left behind, ignored and forgotten about after decades of Labour-run councils and Labour MPs. Last December, my friends, family and constituents voted for change. They want to see the glory days return to Ashfield and Eastwood, which was once the beating heart of Nottinghamshire through mining, textiles and engineering. Can my right honourable friend please reassure me that Ashfield and Eastwood will no longer be the forgotten constituency, and that he will do all he can to make sure we get the investment we need to secure better jobs, better education, better training and a better future?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell my honourable friend, who is a fantastic campaigner for Ashfield, that they are in line for the town deal proposals as part of the £3.6 billion town deals fund and the £250 million growth deals announced through to 2021. And I hope he'll take that good news back to Ashfield.
Let's head up to Scotland with Alan Dorrant. Alan Dorrant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has been asked this question before by my SNP colleagues and others, but they have never received a direct response. I will therefore ask the Prime Minister again. Will he confirm that the temporary £20 universal credit uplift will be made permanent after April next year, and that those who are currently excluded from the uplift will be included?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know that I've given that answer many times, and that's because the answer remains the same, which is that the uplift will remain in place through to April next year. And as I said, when you combine the JSS with UC, people get 93% of their income. I appreciate that times are tough, but the best thing we can do, Mr. Speaker, is keep this economy moving if we possibly can, keep our kids in school, and avert the disaster, Labour's words, Mr. Speaker, the disaster of another national lockdown.
Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister join me in thanking the great businesses of Wolverhampton, like Greg at GI Barbers and Baked in Technol, for continuing to serve the community in difficult times? Would he also reconfirm his commitment to invest and level up Wolverhampton? And when we've come through this stronger, can I invite him to come and see them businesses himself?
Prime Minister.
Well, I have happy memories, Mr. Speaker, of sampling some of the fare in Wolverhampton with my honourable friend, and I can tell him that the Black Country City deal has just seen an investment of 5.8 million, and that the West Midlands Combined Authority was just awarded £66 million for projects across the area, including £15 million for the National Brownfield Institute that is due to be located in Wolverhampton. And Wolverhampton, Mr. Speaker, was the birthplace of the first industrial revolution. It is now teeming with opportunity in the latest.
Let's go to Northern Ireland with Gregory Campbell. Gregory Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware the Northern Ireland Executive have just announced new restrictions to bear down on the virus, while still keeping schools open, with the exception of one extra week at Halloween, and keeping most sectors of the economy going. But the sectors that are missing are hospitality, the associated supply chains, and self-employed. What plans does he have to announce something to help these much needed sectors that are in dire need and need assistance urgently?
Prime Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman, and I am in continuous contact, as he can imagine, both with the leader and the deputy leader in Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland, of course, will receive at least £2.4 billion in additional funding as a result of Barnett consequentials, but we will look at further measures, further imaginative and creative measures to support jobs, to support livelihoods across the whole of the UK.
Herb Bradley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This Sunday marks the 11th day of the Anti-Slavery Day for the United Kingdom, an opportunity for all of us to raise awareness of the heinous crime of modern slavery. Would my right honourable friend use this opportunity to reinforce the UK's global leadership on this issue? And can he confirm that the treating victims with dignity and respect will always be at the heart of everything this government does in response to this crime?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I certainly can confirm what my right honourable says about treating victims with dignity and respect, and she's right to take pride in what this government has done in introducing the Modern Slavery Act. And thanks to that act, we're identifying more victims, Mr. Speaker, of modern slavery than ever before. 10,000 potential victims of modern slavery identified in 2019. That is a 52% increase. It is this government, this House and this country that is leading the campaign against modern slavery.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I entered Parliament this morning and I checked in using the contact tracing app. And when I return to Fife on the train tomorrow, I will need to manually switch to the Scottish app, as it doesn't happen automatically. We're facing a second wave of infections across the UK, so test and trace is even more critical. So given the Prime Minister's support for a four nations approach, can I ask the Prime Minister what engagement has taken place on app interoperability, because that's critical, particularly in border communities?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable lady for pointing that out. I will make sure that there is interoperability. I will do what I can to ensure there's interoperability across all four nations. There is a slightly different approach, as she knows, in Northern Ireland already. But in the bulk of our approach, we have so far taken, there is much more in common than sets us apart.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the government's commitment to establish free ports. And the port of Immingham in my constituency is by tonnage the largest port in the country. Would the Prime Minister agree that it would be somewhat remiss not to include Immingham in the free port programme?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank him for his campaigning for Immingham. It's registered, but Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend should know that he is one of the most successful campaigners in this House already this year, because the new bridge that he asked for at Suggett's Lane Crossing, the new bridge that he asked for, is going to be completed between the summer and the autumn of next year, Mr. Speaker, so he can carry that back in triumph to Suggett's Lane.
We now head up to Scotland with Anne McLaughlin. Anne McLaughlin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My lovely 88-year-old constituent Mary feels foolish for falling for it. She's talking about being missold Greendale products by Helms, a government-approved company, in 2013. She's talking about being saddled with a 25-year loan, which she must live to 106 to pay off. At the speed with which the complaints are being dealt with by Bays, I'll be 106 by the time we get any kind of resolution. Will the Prime Minister please commit to investigating why Mary, who's watching now, and hundreds of others are waiting years to be compensated for something that happened not because they were foolish, but because they were victims of mis-selling?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm afraid to say what the Honourable Lady raises is incredibly important, and she's right to raise it, and we must accelerate the process by which these complaints are upheld and dealt with, and compensation is delivered, if only because that is the only way to build public confidence in all the retrofitting, all the insulation, all the improvements to our homes that we need to deliver across the whole of the country as part of our green industrial revolution. So she is spot on, and I'll be writing to her about that case.
Point of order.
Point of order, John Butler.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the remote participation bill that stands in my name that was due to have its second reading on Friday, which was originally tabled by the member for Swansea West, in light of your comments earlier today, can you please advise me how best we can ensure that remote participation bill becomes a reality for this House?
First of all, can I say I'm grateful for giving notice of the point of order. Her decision to defer the second reading of her bill and the government's position on the provisions it may contain are not matters for the Chair, as you are aware. But, in making her point of order, she has placed her hopes on record, and I'm sure that it will be listened to on the Treasury bench, and I do have sympathy, but unfortunately it is not for my decision. Right, let us now get to, in order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business, the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order. Now come to presentation bill, Peter Hobhouse.
All ethnic minority shortlists bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 12th of March.
Friday the 12th of March. Thank you. Right. Let's begin to start with the next part. We come to the 10-minute rule bill. We've got Andrew Rosendale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to establish rights to keep dogs and other animals in domestic accommodation, to make provision about the protection and welfare of dogs and other animals, and for connected purposes. Mr. Speaker, what makes somewhere a home is something where special moments are created, living with a family, friends, or companions. Moving into a new home is a normal part of life. But what if every time you moved, you faced the threat of being separated from someone you loved? Can a house or a flat ever really be a home if you have been forced to abandon a family member just to be able to move in? And you will know more than anyone, Mr. Speaker, as an animal-loving speaker as you are, that animals are truly members of one's family. And having owned 2 Staffordshire Bull Terriers myself, Spike and Buster, I also know just how close the bonds can be between a dog and the owner, and how devastating it is when you lose them. So dogs are more than man's best friend. They are equal members of the family. And for most people, being separated from your dog is really no different than being separated from your brother or your sister. But sadly, every year, pet owners who move into rented accommodation are faced with the reality that their family could be torn apart because most landlords in Britain have unnecessary bans or restrictions on pet ownership. And for those people who depend on the companionship of their dog and who need that loving friend to be with them, especially those who live alone, such restrictions are nothing less than discrimination, cruel to both the owner and the animal alike. So, my bill brings an end to this discrimination, making it a right for someone to own a dog or another domestic animal to live in their rented home, provided the owner demonstrates responsibility and care for the animal. My bill will henceforth be known as Jasmine's Law, after a Weimaraner who is owned by the Adams family in Surrey. Jasmine lives with Maria, but her son, Jordan Adams, would dearly love to accommodate Jasmine at his home apartment, if only just for a few days, or when his mother goes on holiday. But because of restrictions imposed on tenants where he lives, Jordan is one of the millions of people across the UK who is prevented from having his beloved Jasmine over to stay with him. Many pet owners across Britain, just like Jordan, are absolutely devastated to find that moving out of their family home means being separated from an animal that is such an important part of their lives. So the no pet clause on rented accommodation means that someone cannot have a dog over, not even for a short period, for fear of recriminations or even losing their home. So instead of a dog staying with a familiar person, often they have to be placed in a kennel, which for the dog can prove to be a deeply unhappy and stressful experience. And so, Mr. Speaker, discrimination of this sort must now end. Some people who move to a new home are able to find somewhere for the animal to live with trusted friends or family, but others are tragically forced to abandon their pets altogether, unable to find anywhere to live where the pet will be accepted. Sadly, these no-pet rules are now cited by Battersea Dogs and Cats Home as the second biggest factor behind people giving up their dogs, which has led to more than 200 dogs a year handed in for rehoming simply because of landlord restrictions. These rules have the cruelest impact on the homeless, with many relying on companion animals for support and affection whilst living on the street. And too often, when they are offered housing by local authorities or housing association, it comes with no pet clauses. If they turn down an offer of accommodation, they are told that they will be making themselves intentionally homeless and refused further housing assistance. And take the tragic case of John Chadwick, a homeless man who ended his own life after the only housing option his local council provided was one that meant separation from his pets. It is, Mr. Speaker, surely time to end this no pet clauses which have caused so much pain and heartache to so many people. Of course, many landlords have legitimate concerns which I do not want to dismiss lightly. It is true that irresponsibly owned pets can be a cause of damage, misery and suffering to the animals themselves, to the neighbours and also to those who manage and own properties. We must therefore ensure that landlords' concerns are met and that pet owners pass the test of responsible ownership by obtaining a certificate from a vet before moving in, confirming that they have a healthy, well-behaved animal and are considered to be a responsible owner. With a dog, a responsible ownership checklist would include being vaccinated and microchipped and is responsive to basic training commands, with appropriate rules applying, of course, to other animals. I hope that landlords and local authorities and housing associations listening to this debate today will consider overhauling their current policies in favour of one along the lines laid out in this bill, considering more fairly the rights of millions of responsible owners across the land. And particularly at a time when so many people are isolated, being able to own a dog can be vital to a person's well-being and, of course, their mental health. If tenants can prove that they are responsible owners and that their pets are well behaved and appropriate for the accommodation, then there is, I believe, no reason to deny them the right to live together with their animal companion. And microchipping is also a key element of my bill, and it will stipulate that all cats and dogs kept in rented accommodation must be microchipped. It would also be mandatory for vets to scan animals brought into their surgery, ensuring they are with their rightful owners. This will have the added advantage of helping to find both lost and stolen dogs. And may I commend the amazing work of Debbie Matthews and the group she founded, Vets Get Scanning, who have campaigned for this for over a decade, championed by her late father, the great Sir Bruce Forsyth. So part of the approval process for a pet to be moved into accommodation would be to have their microchip scanned by a vet to ensure they are registered on a national database. Mr. Speaker, it cannot be right that so many pet owners in this country face the harsh reality that finding a place to live might mean permanent separation from the animal that they love so much. Surely, as we take back control of our laws, now is the time to ensure that this nation of animal lovers remains a world leader in animal welfare. If France, Belgium, Germany and Switzerland can outlaw blanket restrictions on pets in rented accommodation, why can't we do the same here in the United Kingdom? The government's intention to remove no pet clauses from its model tenancy agreement is a step in the right direction, but it doesn't go far enough. So, Jasmine's law will replace the outdated and unfair no pet clauses that many private and social landlords impose, setting out an alternative, streamlined system that will mean peace of mind for landlords, tenants, and of course the animals themselves. At its core, my bill represents the values of personal responsibility, individual rights and animal welfare. And so today, I seek to enshrine in law these important freedoms applicable to all responsible pet owners throughout the nation. And so I commend Jasmine's Law, this bill, to the House.
That the honourable member have to leave to bring in the bill. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare to bring in the bill?
Robert Halfon, Andrea Leadsom, Mrs Cheryl Murray, Sir David Amis, Teresa Villiers, Henry Smith, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, Chris Bryant, Tim Farron, Ian Lavery, Miss Lynn Brown, and myself, Mr Speaker.
Andrew Rosendale.
Dogs and Domestic Animals Accommodation and Protection Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 29th of January, Mr Speaker.
The 29th of January. Well done, Andrew. Right, we now come to the first opposition day motion on the COVID-19 economic support package. I inform the House that I have selected the amendment in the name of the Prime Minister. I now call on Liz Dodds, Shadow Chancellor, to move the motion. Shadow Chancellor.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. We're at a critical moment for our country. Infection rates are rising and the economic outlook is worsening. It's more vital than ever that this government gets a grip on both the health and the economic crisis. There are some who seek to pit people's health against our economy. But we all know that our country has suffered a double tragedy: the highest excess death rate in Europe and the deepest recession in the G7. The predominant reason why many expect our recovery to proceed more slowly than that in other countries is the continued severe impact of the public health crisis in the UK. It's been suggested that the Chancellor blocked proposals from the SAGE Committee for circuit breaker. He can now, if he wishes to, intervene on me and set the record straight. I asked the Chancellor to intervene on me. I'm willing for another member to, and maybe the Chancellor will follow. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I'm very grateful. She mentioned a circuit breaker, but in the guidance from SAGE, it says multiple circuit breakers might be required to bring the virus under control. How many jobs does she believe those circuit breakers would cost?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I was just about to go on to say that the current stance from this government is costing jobs. It's leading to a situation of reduced business confidence, and if we continue as we are without taking control of the public health situation, then we'll see a worse situation for jobs and businesses in our country. It appears that will be the only intervention that I'm going to experience just now. And it's very clear that blocking a circuit breaker does not make sense for the health of our population, and it does not make sense for our economy. And I believe members on the opposite side need to have a reality check here. 1 in 4 people in our country are subject to localised restrictions. We've already experienced a record rise in quarterly redundancies. Without action, we face the prospect of infections rising yet again, with more and more areas coming under localised restrictions and the government eventually being forced in to more national restrictions in any case. Every week of that inaction will hit business and consumer confidence, costing more jobs and livelihoods, and with more businesses going to the wall. The question... I'll continue a little and then let others intervene. Thank you. The question is not whether we can afford a circuit breaker. The question is whether we can afford to continue with a government that ducks taking hard choices until it's forced into them. A government that seems unable to stand apart from its chaotic lurching from week to week to assess what our country needs and take decisive action. That circuit break must be used to fix, test and trace, devolving it to local areas so we can protect our NHS, get control of the virus and start building economic confidence back up again. and it must be accompanied by support for jobs and businesses. And we stand ready to work with government to ensure that is put into place so no one is pushed into poverty for doing the right thing. I have to take that intervention. Thank you.
The Sage warn that a circuit breaker is unavoidable, and I wonder if the Prime Minister's words will come back to haunt him, and in a couple of weeks' time he admits that and does yet another U-turn. But the best restrictions in the world will only work if people have financial security and can afford to comply. So isn't it the case that only offering 67% of pay to somebody on minimum wage doesn't cover the 100% of bills that they have to pay? And isn't that why that is something that needs attention, as is the 1.3 billion underspend for all of those people who so far have had no help in this crisis at all?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for making those points, and I think he put his finger on it. It appears that expert opinion is very clear that we are facing an unavoidable situation of rising infections which will not be stemmed unless action is taken. They predict that government will be forced into this position eventually. So why can't we have decisiveness at this stage? That nettle being grasped when it will be more effective than leaving this unavoidable choice many weeks into the future, when it will be less effective. Now, I'll come to the other issues raised by my honourable friend about the paucity of targeted support in a moment. Now, time and time again, Mr. Speaker, Labour have had to drag government ministers to this House to explain what they will do to tackle the job crisis. And time again, they've either ducked the question entirely or come up with a short-term scheme that needs to be patched up again within weeks. The British people deserve better. To protect jobs, be that during a circuit break or under the government's new three-tier scheme, we need a functioning system of wage support, a proper safety net to prevent people falling into poverty, and economic support for local areas that goes hand in hand with the imposition of additional restrictions. Right now, we don't have any of those things. Yes, I'd happily give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Right Honourable Lady for giving way. I'm astounded by what the Labour Party is saying today. And how can she explain that to my constituents in Truro and Falmouth, where the infection rate is incredibly low? The best form of support for the people working in Truro and Falmouth is for their own businesses to continue as they are for as long as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I would respectfully suggest to the lady opposite that she reads those Sage papers. When she reads them, she will see, I'm very pleased that she has, I'm grateful that she has, she will then understand their prediction that this infection is rising right across the country, in rural areas, in coastal areas, and that unless we take action, unless we deal with that now, the problems that we are experiencing around business confidence, costing jobs, forcing businesses to the wall right now will only continue. We need to give ourselves a fighting chance that we could approach Christmas, so important for businesses in this country, without the current rising levels of infection. I'm concerned about the future of this economy, and I want a government that has that long-sighted approach rather than lurching from crisis to crisis. Now, we should, Mr. Speaker, have had a back-to-work budget in July. But we got instead a summer statement, including a last-minute bonus scheme that will see £2.6 billion of public money handed over to firms that don't need it. In September, Labour set out 3 steps for a better, more secure economic future to recover jobs, retrain workers and rebuild business. Instead, after we summoned him to this House, we got the Chancellor's winter economy plan and a wage support scheme that doesn't meet the core test of incentivising employers to keep staff on part-time rather than let staff go. Now, 2 weeks later, Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor was back, trying to fix problems with that scheme as it became rapidly apparent that the health crisis was careering away from the government and economic support was not keeping pace. And then last Friday and this Monday, we had yet more announcements, which creates as many questions as the answer. I regret that these weren't faced up to largely yesterday during the urgent question which I brought to the House. So I'll try again, and now I can ask the Chancellor directly. Why? has the government adopted such an inconsistent approach to financial support for businesses in affected areas? Leicester and Oadby and Wigston had to wait a month to get the £7.30 per head in support that they were belatedly provided with. The initial funding, though, for Liverpool City region, Warrington, Hartlepool and Middlesbrough was in contrast £3.49 a head, but not for businesses. That was for COVID-related action. Last Friday, the Chancellor rebranded £100 million of funding for local councils as surge funding, with no details of how that would be allocated, and the admission that £20 million had already been spent. On Monday, the Prime Minister spoke of more funding to local authorities, but again, without details of how that money would be allocated, although apparently not to support local businesses. This situation is a mess. When local leaders are crying out for certainty, they need to know that if additional restrictions are coming, there's a clear and agreed formula for how much economic support they'll receive and how it will be deployed. I'm happy to take an intervention on that point.
Taking an intervention. Because the Honourable Lady has mentioned my constituency in Oadby and Wigston, can I simply say that the Chancellor moved incredibly quickly to provide extra business support to my constituency. We had a different lockdown to everyone else. It worked. We brought cases down from 160 to 25 per 100,000. And that is an example of why the local approach is the right one and why her colleague, the Shadow Health Secretary, was right yesterday to say what she's now suggesting would be disastrous.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I regret to say that the honourable member, for whom I have a lot of respect, is sadly confused. It would have been useful if he'd listened to the point I just made, which was to contrast the support that was provided to the Leicester area, specifically focused on businesses. I believe that it was designed through, the negotiation occurred through the Local Business Improvement District, local LEP, local authorities, in order to ensure that support was there for businesses. For his area, yes. Now, can he please intervene on me now and say which other areas of the country, subject to additional restrictions, have received funding specifically focused at businesses of that type? No, he can't, because that support has not been provided in the same manner to other places as how it was provided to Leicester. This is a lack of consistency which is causing enormous problems for local authorities. Oh, maybe he's discovered another area. I'm very happy to take that intervention.
The Honourable Lady invited an intervention. I thought it would be unchivalrous not to provide one. Money was provided for my constituency because pubs had been shut. And yesterday, the party opposite voted against shutting pubs at 10 p.m, but in favour of shutting down the entire economy instead. The idea that this is a proportionate response is absurd.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I regret that the member opposite did not answer the question that I asked him, which was whether he knew of any other area of the country which had been treated in the same way as his constituency by being provided with business-related support. And he couldn't answer that question. The reason why is because it appears no other area has been. We've got a radically different approach being taken to different parts of the country, so local leaders cannot plan, local businesses cannot plan, because they do not know whether support will be there or not. I'll make a little progress if my honourable friend doesn't mind. So we need to find out from this government why it has not used that £1.3 billion underspend from the grants programme that was already allocated as business support for those local areas to be directed at businesses that need that help. Yesterday, the Chief Secretary said the money wasn't available for use now because, in his words, the need had been met. The need has been met. This beggars belief. The need clearly has not been met. The government should reallocate that funding on a consistent basis so that businesses in the hardest hit areas can get support. Secondly, what possible justification can there be for local areas only getting control of test, trace and isolate once they're into Tier 3 and thus facing rapidly rising infection rates? As the debate following this one will indicate, this government has poured vast amounts of public money into private contracts to deliver a system that is simply not working. Labour-run Wales have shown how locally delivered tracing is vastly more effective than the contracted-out system. So I want to ask the Chancellor, when will his government stop dithering, follow the evidence and get a grip on test, track and trace.
The Shadow Chancellor for giving way. On the Welsh system, one of the key benefits is allowing local government to track and trace where people may have had the virus, been in contact with someone. And does she not agree that it would be something, if the UK government could apply that to England, it could actually save many people's lives?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm grateful to my honourable friend for making that point. I believe that actually the contact rate is radically higher. It's above 90%, very significantly different. And we're in a peculiar situation where our government appears to believe it only makes sense for local areas to get those powers and the resources necessary to deliver them once infections are already at an extremely high rate, once they're in Tier 3. I find this very peculiar. Perhaps the Chancellor can explain why that support is only provided once local areas are at a high infection level. Now, adequate support must be provided to those at the sharpest end of this crisis, working in businesses that have been closed for public health reasons. The expansion of the job support scheme to closed businesses acknowledges an obvious gap in the original scheme. Now, the government maintains that with its changes to universal credit, the lowest paid workers will receive up to 88% of their previous income, but that ignores the continuing problems that this government refuses to fix with universal credit and allied areas of policy. Why is it still not uprated the local housing allowance to median market rents so affected people can cover their housing costs? Why won't it extend the ban on evictions? Why has it retained the benefit cap, now affecting twice as many people as at the start of this crisis? Why hasn't it abolished the two-child limit on universal credit and tax credits? Will the government follow the last Labour government and reduce the waiting period for the support for mortgage interest scheme? The list of questions goes on, and it includes really significant ones about those firms which have not been legally required to close, but where business has been heavily impacted by the imposition of new restrictions, so they'll struggle to keep staff on even a third of their hours. For those firms, the Chancellor's job support scheme too often fails to incentivise businesses to bring back more staff part-time instead of keeping some full-time and letting others go. I'm happy to take an intervention, gentlemen.
For giving way on that particular point. When she talks about government intervention and support, will she welcome the Eat Out to Help Out scheme that meant ceramic tableware manufacturers in Stoke-on-Trent saw orders massively increase? And will she personally write to apologise to them by saying that she wants to shut down the hospitality sector and therefore make sure the kilns never start up again?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been very grateful to those representatives of the ceramics sector with whom I've had a lot of dialogue. I'm very concerned about their situation. I'm concerned about the lack of targeted support that has been provided to maintain our manufacturing capacity. And I regret that the member opposite did not listen to what not just Labour, but in addition, SAGE experts have been stating clearly, that this government will end up being forced potentially into a situation where it must apply additional restrictions. Why wait until a time when they will be less effective, when we will have had many weeks of reduced business confidence, where the very restaurants that I too am deeply concerned about will have suffered for week upon week of reduced demand? Take decisive action now. That's what's needed. Now, Mr. Speaker, in key sectors, the cost of keeping on more staff on fewer hours is higher in the UK scheme than under comparable initiatives in Germany, France and the Netherlands, even when the poorly designed job retention bonus is factored in. Businesses want to do the right thing by their staff, Mr. Speaker, but the Chancellor is pushing them to flip a coin and decide who stays and who goes. When will he fix the flaws in the job support scheme? Now, the government has also left yawning gaps in its offer for the self-employed. From the start of next month, the support available will fall from 70% of pre-crisis profits to just 20%. That might be an appropriate policy if we were seeing a healthy economic recovery and rising consumer demand, but that is very sadly not the case. We need a targeted scheme that works for those self-employed people for whom business is still nothing like back to normal. And still, months on from the start of the crisis and the first package of economic support, there are too many people who have fallen through the gaps. The government's message to these people is just, you're on your own, sink or swim. Well, that's not good enough. So I ask again, what will the government do to help those who've been excluded from support so far? I'll take one last intervention. I'm aware there are many who want to speak in this debate. Thank you.
Makes important points about the difficulties faced by so many people in the economy. Explain to me how they will be helped by closing down the entire economy. It's the madhouse of fixing the windows or knocking the whole house down.
Thank you. Very good.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, the member doesn't appear to be aware that the windows are already broken, that in a quarter of this country we see those businesses having been subject to additional restrictions. We see none of them having moved out of that, aside from Luton, which appears sadly to be in a difficult situation again now. We see the government's own expert advisers saying that it is likely to be forced into a position where it has to apply additional restrictions in the future when they will be less effective, because by that point infection will have been spread further across this country. So the question is whether action is taken decisively when it can be most effective, or whether we push this back, the costs increase, business confidence continues to erode, people continue to lose their jobs, businesses continue to go to the wall. That is the question that this government needs to answer, Mr. Speaker. Now, if we're to avoid the bleakest of winters, this government has to get a grip. We need a national reset. For that to work, we need an economic package that acknowledges reality and gets ahead of the problems we face. A wage support scheme that works properly, a safety net worthy of the name, and financial support that goes hand in hand with the imposition of extra restrictions. We brought this motion to the House today. I won't, because so many members want to come in on this debate. We brought this motion to the House today because the government has not been doing what it takes to support areas under additional local restrictions. Currently, in the north of England and parts of the Midlands, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, members representing those areas know this is the case. They know that's the case. So I appeal to them to put their constituents' jobs and livelihoods first and support this opposition motion. Thank you.
The question is, on the order paper. Please. No, actually, both of you can both be quiet. I want to get on with the business. But in fairness, I don't want one person starting to entice others. So, right, let's see if we can make some progress. Let's have a good debate, and well-mannered might be helpful to this House. The question is, as on the order paper, I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer to move the amendment. Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Mr. Speaker, I very much welcome the opportunity to update Parliament and the country on the economic challenges we face and our plan to tackle them. My message to honourable members on all sides of the House is simply this. We must not shy away from the burden of responsibility to take decisions and to lead. We must do this with honesty and cooperation. We cannot allow the virus to take hold. We must prevent the strain on our NHS becoming unbearable. But we must also acknowledge the stark reality of the economic and social impacts of another national lockdown. The costs of doing so are not abstract, they are real. They can be counted in jobs lost, businesses closed, and children's educations harmed. They can be measured in the permanent damage done to our economy, which will undermine our long-term ability to fund our NHS and our valued public services. And they can be measured in the increase in long-term health conditions that unemployment causes. This is not about choosing one side or the other. It is not about taking decisions because they are popular. It is not about health versus wealth or any other simplistic lens we choose to view this moment through. The Prime Minister was absolutely right when he set out our desire for a balanced approach, taking the difficult decisions to save lives and keep the R rate down while doing everything in our power to protect the jobs and livelihoods of the British people. And the evidence shows a regional, tiered approach is right because it prevents rushing to another lockdown the entire country would suffer, rather than targeting that support, preventing a lockdown in parts of the country where the virus rates are low. This is an imperfect solution. I'll make some progress. We have been consistently honest about the difficulties and hard choices that this moment presents. We've heard a lot about the SAGE advice. The SAGE minutes themselves say ministers must consider the associated costs in terms of health and well-being and the economic impacts alongside any epidemiological assessment. However, it seems like the only people not prepared to confront this reality are the party opposite. Which is surprising, Mr. Speaker, given that just days ago the Shadow Health Secretary said a new national lockdown would be disastrous for society and would cause unimaginable damage to our economy and well-being. I'm happy to take intervention.
His response would have more credibility if he wasn't stood there after month of failure, if he wasn't stood there with a government whose testing and tracing regime and whose entire approach has got us to this point in the first place. We all recognise how expensive this is going to be, but it's happened because of the failure that he and his party have facilitated.
Mr. Speaker, the debate following this will address test and trace. It's worth bearing in mind over £12 billion has invested in our test and trace capacity. The increase in testing capacity has risen from simply 10,000 a day at the start of this crisis to close to 300,000 today, on its way up to 500,000, and, Mr. Speaker, now ranks as one of the most comprehensive testing regimes anywhere in Europe. I'm happy to take an intervention.
Would my honourable friend agree with me that faced between the choice between a national blunt instrument that would wreak enormous economic damage and something that's more finely calibrated, region by region, based on the science, there's no choice to make?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. It is a blunt instrument. It would cause needless damage to parts of our country where virus rates are low. And having spent weeks indulging themselves with political attacks on this government's efforts to protect jobs, they have now flipped, Mr. Speaker, and support a blunt national lockdown. And they won't say how much damage this will do to jobs or livelihoods. They won't say how they plan to support businesses through it, and they don't seem to care about the long-term stability of the public finances. If they did, would hear...
Sorry, Chancellor. Please, I can't hear the Chancellor. No, I want to hear him, and I'm sure the people out there want to hear him. So please, if he's going to give way, the Chancellor's a generous man. He will give way and he'll indicate. But in the meantime, I don't need people shouting. Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if we did, we would hear from the Honourable Lady opposite about how many jobs Labour's lockdown would cost. I'm happy to give way to the gentleman.
Well, to the generous Chancellor for giving way. Today, the North East Child Poverty Commission said 35% of children in the North East region are living in poverty. As a direct result of Conservative policies, we're going to see that number increase. What's he going to do about those children?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the most vulnerable have been at the forefront of our minds throughout this crisis, which is why, as was published over the summer, it is clear the distributional impact of our interventions has benefited those on the lowest incomes the most. It is there in black and white, a Conservative government making sure the most vulnerable are protected through this crisis. Mr. Speaker, any responsible party of government would acknowledge the economic cost of the blunt national lockdown. The party opposite may say they have a plan, but be under no illusions. A plan blind to the hard choices we face, a plan blind and detached from reality, Mr. Speaker, is no plan at all. I'm happy to take an intervention.
I thank the Chancellor for giving way. In the Liverpool City region, which contains my constituency of Wallasey, there is £40 million of unspent support for business that the Chancellor very generously granted in the first wave of the pandemic. Will he now, today, at that dispatch box, get up and say that given that we are in Tier 3, he will release that 40 million so that the local authorities in the Liverpool City region can apply that money to help their local businesses during the highest level of lockdown which we're suffering at the moment?
Mr. Speaker, I say to the Honourable Lady, I know what a difficult time for her and her constituents this is. With regard to the underspends, and I'll come to this later, I think it's wrong to think of them in that way. What this was is the government giving an advance to local authorities to make payments to businesses. That was done on a basis that every local authority will have a wildly different degree of over or underspend, which we true up at the end of the process. We could equally have asked local authorities to make payments themselves and reimburse them afterwards. But what I would say is that there is significant financial support both for her local authority and the businesses in her area that are closed down. That was announced by the Prime Minister, and I will come on to address that in detail later. And it is right that that support is there. But, Mr. Speaker, let me please reiterate our plan. The House will be well aware of the gravity of our economic situation. The latest figures show our economy grew by 6% in July, 2% in August, but remains almost 10% smaller than it was before coronavirus hit. Business investment suffered a record fall in the second quarter of this year. Consumer sentiment remains well below its long-run average. And despite the significant support we have provided, the data is beginning to reveal the true extent of the damage coronavirus has caused our labour market. The latest statistics published just yesterday show employment falling, unemployment rising, welfare claims rising. And the revisions the ONS have made to their previous estimates show that unemployment was higher than they thought over the summer. Mr. Speaker, I have talked about facing up to the difficult truths clearly, and we are facing an economic emergency. But we are acting on a scale commensurate with this emergency as we address my single biggest priority to protect people's jobs and their livelihoods. We have put in place a comprehensive plan to protect, support and create jobs in every region and nation of the United Kingdom. Through more than £200 billion of support since March, we're protecting more than 9.5 million jobs through the job retention schemes, strengthening our welfare safety net with an extra £9 billion for the lowest paid and most vulnerable, granting more than £13.5 billion to those who are self-employed, with further grants to come, protecting over 1 million small and medium-sized businesses through £100 billion of tax cuts, tax deferrals, direct grants and government-backed loans. Happy to give way.
I'm very grateful. Does he agree that the best way to protect jobs is to keep the economy open wherever possible? Yes. Most other nations are using a local restrictions approach to deal with this, including Germany, which is using lockdowns at a district level, not even at a state or county level. Does he agree that's the best way forward?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. The only sustainable way to protect jobs in the long run is to have an economy that is open and functioning. No amount of support can make up for that. But, Mr. Speaker, the other things we have done: eased repayment terms on those loans through Pay As You Grow, delivered on our promise to give the NHS what it needs, backed hundreds of thousands of young people to find good jobs through the Kickstart scheme and new investment in training and apprenticeships, creating green jobs through the £2 billion Green Homes Grant Programme, showing that we're here for our cultural sector with a Cultural Recovery Fund, a further support package for charities, and investing hundreds of billions of pounds in the largest, most sustained programme of infrastructure investment that the UK has seen in decades. Comprehensive action, Mr. Speaker, to protect the jobs and livelihoods of the British people. And it undermines the credibility of the party opposite that in the face of all of that support, they continue to pretend that insufficient action is being taken. I'm going to make some progress. Mr. Speaker, as the crisis evolves, our economic response will also evolve. What we will see over the winter is a complex picture of some businesses able to open safely and others being ordered to close to control the spread of the virus. So our winter economy plan provides a toolkit to protect jobs and businesses over the difficult weeks and months to come. The plan has 3 parts. First, the job support scheme, will protect jobs in businesses that are open or closed. If businesses can open safely, but with reduced or uncertain demand, the government will directly subsidise people's wages over the winter, giving those employers the option to bring people back to work on shorter hours rather than making them redundant. And we're expanding the job support scheme to give more support to businesses that are ordered to close. For people unable to work for 1 week or more, their employer will still be able to pay them 2/3 of their normal salary, and the UK government will cover the cost. This national programme will benefit people the same, wherever they live and whatever job they do. Happy to give way.
To him for giving way. There seems to me to be a basic dishonesty at the heart of these Tier 2 plans, because there is no support for pubs. Pubs are being told they're allowed to stay open, but the measures being brought in are actually making them unviable. At least with our approach, what you would see is a short-term hit, but then a reduction in the rate and more of a chance for us to return to normality. Will he at least admit that those pubs in Tier 2 areas are not going to have viable businesses, and say something about what he's going to do to support them?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad finally some acknowledgement that it will be a hit to businesses and jobs from what the party opposite are suggesting. And it is right, Mr. Speaker, that there is support provided for hospitality, which is why this government has provided a VAT reduction, a business rates holiday, direct cash grants, Eat Out to Help Out, and now, Mr. Speaker, the job support scheme directly there to support those businesses that are open and operating, but not at the same level that they were previously. And to give those businesses and their employees certainty, rather than the weeks that I heard about from the Honourable Lady opposite, this scheme will run for 6 months through to the spring. This job support scheme is in line with most other European countries, and to support the lowest paid through this crisis, we have also made our welfare system more generous and more responsive too.
Grateful to the Chancellor giving way, and he will know from York's economic base the fact that we may rise to 27% unemployment in our city because of the complexity of our economy. What additional measures will he put in place to build the bridge in order to get us through this really difficult period, because the job support scheme will just not deliver for my constituents?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd say to the Honourable Lady the job support scheme was widely welcomed, not just by business groups like the CBI and the FSB, but also by the TUC, who I was happy to work closely with to design the job support scheme. But she is right. That is not the only thing that we will do to support jobs, which is why we have put in place the £2 billion Kickstart scheme to provide fully funded job placements for those young people most affected by this crisis, most at risk of unemployment, and thousands of those young Kickstarters will be starting their new jobs this autumn. I have to give way.
Thank my right honourable friend. Does my right honourable friend agree that whilst we all want simple solutions to this crisis, whether that's the opposition suggesting full lockdown or an unlimited extent to furlough, there are no simple solutions. This is a highly complex problem. Every intervention, every support scheme will be nuanced. It has to be regionally effective. There are no simple solutions. We shouldn't be looking for simple solutions. We should be looking for the right ones.
As ever, my honourable friend is spot on. It is not leadership to shy away from the hard choices and real trade-offs that these decisions take. She is absolutely right. Mr. Speaker, the second part of our winter plan is to support businesses who are legally required to close, and we've heard about this previously. Those businesses will now be able to claim a cash grant of up to £3,000 per month, depending on the value of their property. Those grants can be used for any business costs and will not need to be repaid. I've also guaranteed £1.3 billion of funding to the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland administrations so they can choose to do something similar. The Honourable Lady asked if other areas had received this and was under the impression that none others have. I can correct the facts, Mr. Speaker. Bolton is the only other area that has faced hospitality restrictions in this way, and Bolton Council has received, at last count, I believe, almost £200,000 of support to compensate their businesses as that they have been closed in a similar way. Thirdly, Mr.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I fear the Chancellor is confused. I was not talking about the much trumpeted local restriction support grant, which he's right, has only been applied so far to that one area of Bolton. I was talking instead about the business support that was delivered to Leicester, Oadby and Wigston, which I believe has not been provided to any other part of the country. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker, it's the same type of support provided to the local authority to help and support their businesses. I think that was the question she asked my honourable friend, but I'm happy to answer it. The third part of our plan, Mr Speaker, is to provide additional funding for local authorities. And again, I'm happy to correct maybe a misunderstanding of the situation for the Honourable Lady. It is not the case that that support is there only for local authorities in Tier 3. There is a scaled structure, so for all local authorities placed into different tiers, they will receive extra financial support on a per capita basis with the funding formula that my honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, is implementing. And that funding will be worth up to almost £500 million on a national basis to support local areas and their local public health teams with their local response, whether that's more enforcement, compliance or contact tracing. And Mr Speaker, that comes on top of almost £1 billion that my honourable friend, the Prime Minister, announced that we will provide to all local authorities as we talk to them about their needs over this difficult period to help make sure that they can provide the services they need to. And that itself comes on top of £3.7 billion already provided to local authorities. Mr Speaker, this government is dealing with the world as it is. Whilst the Honourable Lady may not wish to confront that reality, I don't have that luxury. We can't just let the virus take hold, but nor can we blithely fall into another national spring-style lockdown as the party opposite now want to do, rather than following our regional, tiered and localised approach. We are dealing with a once-in-a-century event, and I can assure members on all sides of this House that the government is doing all it can to support the country through this crisis. We need a balanced approach. We need a consistent approach. And as Mr Speaker, you will have seen, we also want a cooperative approach. But any responsible party calling for a shutdown of our entire country should be honest about the potential costs, economic and social, of such a dramatic measure. At the very least, they should have the integrity to acknowledge that what they are proposing will create significant damage to people's lives and livelihoods. I have never said there are easy choices or cost-free answers. This is the reality we face, and it would be dishonest to ignore that truth. So no more political games, Mr Speaker, and cheap shots from the sidelines. The party opposite can either be part of this solution or part of the problem. Mr Speaker, it's called leadership, but from them I am not holding my breath.
The original question was as on the order paper, since when an amendment has been proposed as on the order paper. The question is that the original words stand part of the question. Now, just to help members, it will be a 4-minute limit after the SNP spokesperson, David Linden.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Recently we've seen from the government, quite rightly, stark and serious warnings of a second wave of coronavirus cases, with the numbers in hospitals increasing, the infection rate rising and further restrictions being put in place right across the UK. And whilst I and those on these benches welcome what the Chancellor has said recently, it is clear that he and his government are not acting with the urgency that this situation deserves. Quite simply, Madam Deputy Speaker, the plans that he has set in place do not go far enough. Now, I've had countless constituents get in touch over recent weeks concerned with potential job losses and financial insecurity, with many wondering how they will get through the very tough winter months ahead. And the SNP has consistently warned the Chancellor of the Exchequer that his economic plans, as they stand, are inadequate. We on these benches have repeatedly called for support for the industry suffering most during the pandemic, repeatedly called for an extension of the furlough scheme, and repeatedly called for an increase in universal credit to be made permanent. But these calls have, I'm afraid, fallen in deaf ears. However, it is my hope today that the government will listen to what needs to be done, especially considering the recent serious warnings of the devastating impact of a second wave in which we ultimately find ourselves right now. And we in these benches have welcomed the Chancellor announcing that further support will be given to businesses being forced to close in new local lockdowns. However, this scheme, like the other financial packages that the Chancellor has announced, does not, I'm afraid, go far enough. From the 1st of November, the Government will pay 2/3 of each employee's salary of businesses forced to close in new local lockdowns. But this does not, Madam Deputy Speaker, apply to workers whose employers cannot afford wages due to poor trading conditions rather than any new government lockdowns. For them, the 1st of November, the furlough will be replaced by this new job recovery scheme whereby the government will pick up a maximum of just 22%. And to be eligible for the job recovery scheme, a company must pay a worker to work at least a third of the contracted time, and remaining wages are split into 3. Now, the UK government and the company pay a third each, and the worker loses the rest. Now, that is, I'm afraid, completely absurd. Most people cannot afford to simply lose 1/3 of their salary. They don't get a third off their rent, they don't get a third off their fuel, they don't get a third off their shopping when they go to Tesco. Now, I want to turn now to the issue of hospitality, because yesterday James Watt, the owner of Brewdog, had a conversation with Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon to discuss supporting jobs in the hospitality sector, which is a massive priority for us. But he was very clear in his agreement with the First Minister that the end of the job retention scheme will lead to, and I quote in his words, a tsunami of unemployment. He continues to urge the Chancellor to extend the scheme, stating that, and I quote again, the proposed job support scheme will not protect jobs. This is not me as an SNP MP saying to the Chancellor that this is inadequate. This is somebody who's highly respected in the hospitality sector, and the Chancellor would do well to listen to him, if not fiddling on his phone. I'm happy to give way.
Surprising to hear the SNP talk about the need to support the tourism and hospitality sector when they're putting forward rather puritanical bans on alcohol sales, no longer helping pubs, no longer helping the businesses in that sector. So how can he lecture the government on what form of support they should be giving after everything they have done on the 5% cut, or the 15% cut, I beg your pardon?
That was a wonderful addition to try and be a nice PPS, but I'm afraid that the Honourable Gentleman clearly has absolutely no idea whatsoever of the £40 million package put forward by the Scottish Government to the hospitality sector. But perhaps when he's sitting in the south coast of England dreaming up these lovely interventions to please his whips, he would do well to read the full briefing paper. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the leaders of businesses across the UK agree that ending the furlough and job retention scheme is a very irresponsible and reckless decision. So, to avoid mass redundancies, the UK Government must extend the furlough scheme in full. Now, with the huge rise of COVID-19 cases that we've seen so far with the second wave, and with winter months approaching, now is not the time to be taking chances on job losses. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman from Chesterfield.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way, and he's absolutely right about the appalling health consequences and economic consequences of this. But can I just ask him, does he and his party support the advice from Sage for a 2-week circuit breaker so that we can get on top of this health crisis and try and give the government time to get test and trace work? Does he actually support what Labour Party's called for now?
Well, one of the things that we're seeing in Scotland is, for example, that test and trace is working a lot better, and that's because we've not hived it off to, for example, Serco. We've been very clear, I would say to the Honourable Gentleman from Chesterfield, that we will follow scientific advice and we will do our very best to get that balance. And that's what we've seen, the restrictions that came into place just last week in Scotland. We will see how that goes. We're always keeping things under review, but the reality is we do need to follow the advice, and we also need to get a balanced approach, and that's exactly what we're doing, and I'm sure that we'll see that bearing fruit as we kind of come on to that. Now, I want to turn to the issue of the excluded £3 million, because the SNP has consistently and continually raised this issue of the excluded £3 million who were excluded from the Chancellor's initial financial support packages back in the spring. But let's be clear about this. The Treasury continues, I'm afraid, to exclude artists, freelancers and the newly self-employed in these recent economic plans. And 3 million people were shut out of the vital financial support that they desperately needed during the first wave of the pandemic, and they were left to face huge financial insecurity with their livelihoods and their businesses put at risk. And rather than listening to the calls of these 3 million people, the Chancellor has decided to leave behind the self-employed yet again in his economic plans, with the 70% replacement for profits being replaced in November with just 20%. Now, another group that has repeatedly been excluded from the Chancellor's financial packages has been the arts and culture sector. We saw this week the closure of all Cineworld theatres across the UK, including my own in the constituency at Parkhead. So I would again call on the Chancellor to provide sector-specific support for the arts and culture sector, which we know will continue to suffer during the second wave of the pandemic. And I hear the honourable gentleman from Suffolk chuntering away that he's just done that. But many people in our own constituencies from the arts and culture sector make clear to us that support does not go far enough. And if he has done that, why is Cineworld and Parkhead closing, I would ask him. Now, whilst what I've described thus far is a very tough image for countless jobs being at risk, many sectors are vulnerable and some businesses are wondering if they will make it to the new year. But the rising cases should emphasise to the Chamber that we are still in the midst of this pandemic, which has already delivered severe blows to people's incomes and financial security, with the most vulnerable people facing a disproportionate economic hit. That's why the SNP has repeatedly called upon the Government to make that £20 increase to universal credit permanent, and especially after the latest findings from the IFS warning that 4 million families could see their support slashed if the Tory Government refuses to make that £20 uplift to universal credit permanent. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation has also highlighted that nearly 3/4 more people, including 300,000 children, could be forced into poverty if the uplift is not made permanent. Now, that must serve, Madam Deputy Speaker, as a wake-up call for the Government. The Chancellor cannot continue to turn a blind eye to the vast inequality that exists right across the UK. And with the winter months approaching, the poorest and most vulnerable people will suffer the most from the Chancellor's economic plans, and it's quite clear that he has a choice in front of him and that he needs to do much better by them. I'm very happy to give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way on that point. Isn't that exactly right? One way or the other, the Government is going to have to pay for this. It's going to have to meet the costs, and it can either do that by extending the job support schemes, by looking at really imaginative, creative, long-term support like universal incomes, or it's going to have to meet the cost through universal credit, through all the social consequences that come from long-term unemployment and taking us back to the Thatcherite 1980s.
I would say I would agree with my honourable friend, but I've got to say I did give the UK Government a degree of praise at the beginning of the pandemic, because it did seem that they were moving in a way that perhaps was not part of traditional Tory ideology. There were a lot more state intervention, a lot more government support. And so I think there was quite a few of us in this House who, whilst we would disagree enormously on the politics, welcomed the fact that the Chancellor was willing to be innovative and try new things. And one of the things that I would say is that nobody prepares you for a global pandemic. You know, as politicians, there are people in this House who have seen recessions, people who have seen wars. Nobody prepares you for a pandemic. And so, yes, there's got to be a degree of flexibility in all our parts in this House, but the thing that I'm most concerned about is that the British Government seems to have moved away from those creative, innovative solutions that it had at the beginning of the year. We now find ourselves in the midst of a second wave, and all of a sudden that dynamism and that creativity that the Chancellor has been credited with seems to have gone away because of the pressure that comes from people in the 1922 committee, and I don't think that people on the whole are going to forgive that. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Does he agree with the opposition that there should be multiple circuit breakers? And if so, is that what the policy is going to be in Scotland?
I'm sure that the official opposition are proposing multiple circuit breaks, to be fair to them, but it's not my job necessarily to defend the policy of the Labour Party. But what I will defend is the approach of the SNP Scottish Government that is trying to do this in a balanced way, but what we would like to see is a lot more financial flexibility to do that, and that would help if the UK Government gave us those financial powers. So that's what I would say to the honourable gentleman on that point. But I also want to come on to that very point, which is to highlight the work that the Scottish Government has done in terms of supporting business during the second wave of the pandemic. Because the Scottish Government's total package for businesses is over £2.3 billion. That's more than the consequentials received from the UK Government. And as I mentioned to the honourable gentleman earlier, the Scottish Government is making an additional £40 million available to support businesses that will be affected by the new measures and work with affected sectors in the coming days. I am under no doubt, Madam Deputy Speaker, my city in Glasgow is one of those that have been in local lockdown restrictions. The restaurants and bars in my constituency have had to shut down, but we have recognised that when we ask them to shut down, which is a way of trying to reduce the spread of the virus, that support must be coming on that. So the Scottish Government will continue to discuss with businesses how the support package that we've offered can mitigate some or all of the employer's contribution to the UK Job Retention Scheme. We've put in place a £230 million Restart the Economy capital stimulus package to help stimulate the economy Following the pandemic, we've announced details of a £38 million package of support for innovative early-stage businesses, committed to £2.2 million of funding with the Music Venues Trust to provide stability to grassroots music venues over the coming months. But what all of this, Madam Deputy Speaker, should highlight is that the UK Government's financial plans have been and continue to be inadequate, excluding the self-employed, freelancers and artists, prematurely ending the furlough scheme and refusing to make permanent the £20 increase in universal credit. And where we've had the power, the Scottish Government has spent £6.5 billion on COVID, above the Barnett consequentials, and is doing all it can and all within its powers to support businesses across Scotland. However, that is the issue at hand. There is only so much that the Scottish Government can do when the vast majority of Scotland's tax and spending decisions are taken here in Westminster. And case in hand is the fact that the Government cancelling the UK budget simply demonstrates this, that Scotland remains an afterthought for the Tories. And I would be more than happy to give way to the Chancellor if he can stand up and give some sort of clarity to Scotland's Cabinet Secretary for Finance about what budget we're supposed to set when the UK Government has just gone ahead. I'm happy to look forward to that.
Yeah, Madam Deputy, I've addressed this previously in this place and others. There is absolutely no bar on the Scottish Government setting a budget in advance of the UK budget. The fiscal framework itself allows for that very possibility. That is indeed exactly what happened at the start of this year already. So there's simply no reason why that can't happen. The OBR forecasts are provided as normal in this autumn. Those are the forecasts that are used between the officials to make all the necessary calculations. But it is simply wrong to suggest that the Scottish Government is unable to set a budget until the UK Government has.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we've got a Conservative Government that used to be really good on upholding the rule of law. We've got a Conservative Government that used to be very good when it came to management of the economy. But we now have a Chancellor who appears to be wanting the Scottish Government to set a completely blind budget. Now, for somebody who tries to advocate the idea of fiscal responsibility, that strikes me as being a rather bizarre thing. But that is because, and I would say to the Chancellor, that people in Scotland are increasingly aware that the only way to move forward in terms of protecting their economy, in terms of managing their own finances, and in terms of standing on their own 2 feet is with the powers of independence. And with the internal market bill destroying the hard-fought devolution, more and more Scots are supporting the SNP and calling for independence. An Ipsos Mori poll recently just revealed yesterday, revealed that 65% of people in Scotland think that Britain is, I quote, heading in the wrong direction, compared to just 12% who think that Britain is heading in the right direction. And if we want to continue looking at polling, and I know that the UK Government is doing quite a lot of polling on this issue at the moment, they're being a bit coy about releasing that, but thankfully today, Madam Deputy Speaker, Ipsos Mori released a poll that shows that 58% of Scots now support Scottish independence. And so I would suggest to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, that only backs up the point that people in Scotland can see that this UK Government is not doing enough, and therefore they want to see these powers being transferred to Scotland so that we can take our own decisions on these issues. I'll give way to my friend from Dundee East.
Does he not think that the Chancellor's intervention was rather peculiar? The Chancellor is, of course, absolutely right. The Scottish Government can set a budget, notwithstanding that it would be blind. But that may lead, depending upon the Chancellor's decisions, to in-year cuts or in-year changes subsequently. Something I'm sure this Chancellor wouldn't tolerate if someone else was setting part of his budget.
Hear, hear.
With my honourable friend, member for Dundee East on that point, I think he's put that on the record. But Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't want to detain you too much, so I would say that in conclusion, SNP MPs have stood up in this chamber and made calls for the UK Government to do the right thing and support the public through the second wave of COVID-19 cases. And what they've put on the table so far does not go far enough, and that is why we will vote for the motion before the House tonight. And I'm very grateful for your forbearance. Thank you.
Mike Wood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Hospitality is one of Britain's biggest employers. 3.2 million people across the country rely on hospitality for their jobs, including 4,300 of my constituents in Dudley South. My right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has always been a real and true friend of beer and pubs sectors in particular. He knows how much they've been affected by this pandemic, and he's delivered an economic support package comprehensive and unprecedented. Without such a support package, many thousands of pubs, many of our breweries would simply not have survived the spring. They would not have got through the first phase of this outbreak. And I don't know whether he's seen his rather fetching likeness on posters in pubs up and down the country, recognising the contribution that many of those support measures have made in making pubs and other hospitality viable in over the past 6 months. But as we are now firmly in a new phase of this pandemic, new measures really are vital for those businesses that are not necessarily legally compelled to close. For those that are required to close their doors, the grants that he has announced was they may not cover the whole rent and all the fixed costs. There's certainly a substantial contribution to costs that those businesses incur even before they pull a single pint or serve a single meal. But there are also enormous challenges facing venues in areas that are not legally compelled to close, in tiers 1 and 2, where the legal restrictions that have been introduced really do make it impossible for them to operate. So they're not legally compelled to close, but it's legally impossible for them to open. And we know that 1 in 10 pubs have never reopened since March's lockdown, and about 2/3 of those who did reopen were already trading at a loss last month before the introduction of 10 o'clock closing, mandatory table services, and of course the new restrictions that have come into effect today. I shall.
Giving way, and Simon Longbottom of one of the largest pub groups, Stonegate, in the country, has written to me about this, and he could have been making the speech the honourable member is making now. He is very concerned that in Tier 1 and Tier 2 he gets no help whatsoever with his business costs. So can the honourable member give the Chancellor some direct advice on what he needs to do about that?
Well, I mean, I would not presume as to attempt to direct my right honourable friend, beyond saying, of course, that pubs and hospitality cannot continue to operate with almost no income without additional support that's proportionate to the legal restrictions that they face, which may not be in their immediate areas. So I've heard from Titanic Brewery today, a brewery in Stoke, where majority of their customers are in Liverpool, Merseyside, and are actually in tier 3 areas. So they wouldn't receive support, even though their customers being based. These pubs do need urgent additional support. Otherwise, many of these pubs are going to close their doors for good, never going to reopen. And that's a huge loss, not only to our economy, but to our communities.
Eagle. Madam Deputy Speaker, and I rise very much to support the motion that my honourable friend has moved, particularly the part that says that this House believes the government should do what it takes to support areas with additional local restrictions. My own constituency of Garston and Halewood is in the Liverpool City region, which is in Tier 3 restrictions. The Chancellor might not know the unemployment figures in my particular constituency, but I can tell him that they've doubled this year, and that's probably not unlike in many other places. But I also have, that's about 5,000 people. I also have 15,000 people still on furlough in my constituency. Now, I understand that the Chancellor, when he introduced the National Furlough Scheme, would have wanted to have an end point for it, but surely he anticipated that it would be ending when the pandemic was waning. In Liverpool, the pandemic is surging. Madam Deputy Speaker, we have no ICU beds in Liverpool's main hospitals. They're now full. And COVID is impacting on other critical care. So the health service is already being impacted severely in Liverpool. Furlough is going to end in 2 weeks, and those 15,000 jobs are severely at risk right in the middle of a huge resurgence in the virus. Now, the Chancellor has introduced his local furlough for those, that's the colloquial term, for those
businesses that are forced by law to close, and that is the pubs, it's the gyms, it's the businesses that have had to close. I think it's wrong that those people who benefit from that, especially if they're on the minimum wage, should only get 67% of it. The Prime Minister said today that it was 93%. They should get 100% of the national minimum wage. There should be a floor. Let's be clear about that. And I hope that the government can do something about that. One does not have to pay 67% of the bills, or the food doesn't cost only 67% of what it normally does. So something needs to be done to help those people. But the Chancellor should also be very clear that there are many other businesses in my area, like restaurants, for example, that have not been forced to close, but whose business is severely impacted. They have to close at 10 o'clock. They have fewer tables. In my area, there is advice against non-essential travel. It is not an essential travel to go to a restaurant. So people are advised not to go there, but these people are not going to get any support to keep their restaurants open from the local furlough scheme, and many of them will go bust. I'm afraid I can't give way because I only have 4 minutes and some points to make. I do apologise to the honourable gentleman. But the point is that many businesses, many thousands of jobs are at risk, and they will not be getting extra support. I'm sorry that the Chancellor isn't listening. They will not be getting extra support from any of his schemes in a Tier 3 area. Those jobs and businesses are going to go. Those people will be unemployed, and the government will still have to be paying towards their support. And can I also make the point, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the short time that I have left, there are 77,000 people in the Liverpool City region who have been excluded as self-employed people from any support, from any government support. They are barely hanging on. And now with Tier 3 restrictions, yet again, Madam Deputy Speaker, there is no support for these people, for these businesses. What is happening is going to turn this pandemic, by the time Liverpool comes through it, and we will, into a cause of severe poverty and penury. And it is not right that the government is not doing enough to help.
Gareth Davis.
Deputy Speaker, it is a great pleasure to speak in this debate. It is right that we have this debate and that across the House we talk about our national economy. It also gives me a great opportunity to thank the Chancellor on behalf of thousands of Grantham and Stamford constituents for the colossal support that we have received. 16,000 of my constituents were furloughed. 99 of my large businesses received CBIL loans worth £33 million. 1,527 small businesses received bounce-back loans worth £44 million. We had £23 million of grants, and just last week we received £230,000 of cultural funding. So I thank the Chancellor on behalf of literally thousands of my constituents. Yeah. But it is right, though the support package was a £200 billion package of support, unprecedented and globally competitive, we must be mindful of our public finances. In the first 5 months of this tax year, our tax receipts were down 35%. At the same time, Madam Deputy Speaker, our debt to GDP ratio is the highest since 1963. That is a potent combination which must be a sobering fact for everybody across this House, regardless of party politics. And therefore it is right that we have a job support scheme that targets support to those who are facing depressed demand. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would encourage the Chancellor to continue with his plan for jobs, his £30 billion plan for jobs that will see the creation of green jobs through the Green Homes Grant and new jobs for young people through the Kickstarter scheme. I would encourage him to double down and continue with that package of support. I would also encourage the Chancellor to focus on economic growth. This is what ultimately will benefit all of our country across the country. And there are three aspects to this for me, Madam Deputy Speaker. First of all, to release businesses of the burdens that they have had for so many years. We saw the success of the Chancellor's policy to reduce VAT on hospitality businesses. We saw how well received by the CBI the VAT tax deferrals went. I would encourage the Chancellor to look at regulations to ensure that we manage our national regulatory budget to ensure that any new regulation meets cost-benefit analysis that is robust. The second thing I would highlight, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the mobilisation of investment capital, private investment capital. The Future Fund, which is so few, it is not spoken about in this place enough. One of the truly innovative policies of this Chancellor and this government was the Future Fund, which directly intervened and supported pre-revenue, pre-profit businesses. We are the startup capital of Europe, and this Chancellor and this government supported those startup entrepreneurs. But the key aspect of that policy was the fact that it mobilised private capital. We shared the risk with private finance. They brought efficiency to those investments. And I would, again, urge the Chancellor to look at initiatives like a British Development Bank that will help mobilise more private capital for infrastructure investments throughout the future. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, productivity has been pervasive throughout the decades. Whatever the government in power, productivity has been weak compared to our international competitors. Infrastructure investment is critical to this, but so too are skills. I warmly welcome the Prime Minister's efforts and his announcement around the Lifetime Skills Guarantee. This will help constituents like mine in Grantham and in Stamford and Bourne and all of our villages to get the skills they need for the jobs of the future. I warmly applaud the efforts of this government to date, and I thank you for the opportunity for laying that out.
Senator McGovern.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to contribute to this debate on what has been a horrendous week for all in Merseyside. Through the Chancellor, before he leaves the chamber, I would just like, through the Chancellor, to thank the Chief Secretary to the Treasury for agreeing to meet with Merseyside Members of Parliament on the 20th of this month, Madam Deputy Speaker. Just as the Chancellor has just walked out of the chamber now, it's too often felt for us in Merseyside too difficult to get the attention of the Treasury through what has been the most extraordinarily challenging week. And I would just ask the Minister on the Treasury bench to flag with all of his colleagues inside the Treasury how very difficult this situation is for us. We have uniquely been placed in the top tier of restrictions, and that surely demands a unique level of attention and a unique set of interventions to make sure that our economy doesn't go under, and I know that the Minister will take those comments very seriously. I just want to take the short time I have, Madam Deputy Speaker, to make a couple of comments about Merseyside, but before I do, I just want to thank all of those businesses in my constituency who've been in touch with me. I've had sobering conversations with the management of the Thornton Hall Hotel, with who runs the Rose and Crown pub in Bebbington, and they've made absolutely clear to me what the consequences are of this situation. They've done everything, Madam Deputy Speaker, that possibly could have been asked of them. This is a situation not of their making, and I hope that it's a cross-party endeavour in this House to back our hospitality industry. And that's particularly important for the Liverpool City region because we have spent 20 years working to make sure that our visitor economy replaced much of what was lost in deindustrialisation. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, if you had said to me when I was a child that one day people would come for a mini break to Merseyside, I would have laughed. Most people in the country, well, they didn't think that much of us. And all that work could go down the drain if we're not careful. So I would just say to the Minister, don't do it. Help us. Make sure that this place of opportunity with these young and growing businesses offers the country the chance of an economic future that says to anywhere in our nation, it doesn't matter how far down or out you are, Britain offers you hope. And there's a way to do that because whilst our businesses are young, Madam Deputy Speaker, and they don't have huge cash reserves, they're incredibly creative and fast growing, crucially. So if the Treasury does want to see growth, I would heartily recommend to them backing the creative, cultural and visitor economies as Merseyside, and the Minister's nodding, and I thank him for it. We really need that practical support now. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, if the Minister's prepared to work with us, and I know I speak for the Shadow Chancellor here as well, if the Minister's prepared to work with us to help Merseyside, we'll be there, because we never want to go back to the dark days. So I would simply ask everyone in this House to work together to help.
Neil O'Brien.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow such a very good and impassioned speech. Let me start with two important bits of context. The first is that this country, this government, is providing much more support than comparable countries to the economy and to preserve jobs and livelihoods. According to an Institute for Fiscal Studies report earlier this week, while France and Germany and the US are spending about 7% of GDP to support jobs, in the UK we are spending about 12% of GDP, so a much more powerful intervention to help people and preserve livelihoods. And that is quite right, because of course we want to avoid scarring effects of unemployment, we want to keep businesses that are viable together. But the second bit of context leads on from that, which is that according to the IFS, this year we will borrow £350 billion, or 17% of GDP. Not only is it the case that we have never borrowed so much before in our entire peacetime history, it's actually more than we've often borrowed in wartime, more than we borrowed in the first year of the Second World War, to put it into a bit of context. And while the vigorous action that the Chancellor and his ministers are taking is quite right, we would be wrong to think that this is consequence-free. We must spend on a grand scale, we must spend quickly, but we must also spend wisely. And while many members will suggest different things that we could do additionally, it's important to take stock of what we have done so far. We've had the furlough and the equivalent for the self-employed. In my constituency alone, they have helped 18,300 people keep their jobs. That's an amazing achievement. A huge public sector IT project delivered by civil servants without any problems. A fantastic achievement which we should be thankful to them for. We now have the job support scheme, which is more generous than the equivalent in France and Germany, and unlike in the US where no such scheme exists and you're just on your own, we are going to help those people keep their jobs. And on top of that, there's all the other things we're doing to keep jobs. The £57 billion worth of loans across the different loan schemes, with £51 million handed out in my constituency alone. The VAT cut for hospitality, and the deferment of VAT across the board, which has put £30 billion into businesses' cash flow. The grants of up to £25,000 for businesses, and £20 million going to businesses in my constituency alone in hospitality, and the business rates holiday on top of that. And of course, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which has pumped £500,000 into cafes in my constituency alone. But as well as protecting jobs, of course, we've also protected incomes. We've boosted universal credit by £1,000 a year, spent £8 billion in total on extra welfare and a hardship fund, introduced a mortgage holiday that's helped 1 in 6 people with a mortgage in this country. And of course, most importantly of all, we're taking steps to create new jobs. £2 billion for the Kickstart scheme, the £1,000 bonus to take on new trainees, abolishing stamp duty to get the housing market moving, creating new green jobs with new home installation schemes, and of course the brilliant visionary policy of giving every adult over the age of 23 the opportunity to get an A-level qualification whenever they are in their life course, and not writing anybody off anymore. A huge levelling up policy we can be proud of. A report for the think tank Onward the other day pointed out that schemes like the C-Bills and the Job Retention Scheme had helped keep 1 in 8 businesses in this country going and avoided a rise in unemployment of 5 million people. And the Treasury can be rightly proud of averting that disaster. And I would encourage them, and I would encourage the Chancellor, who has been so unorthodox in response to this unorthodox situation, to keep being unorthodox and to keep thinking about ways we can create jobs. You know, we have a lot of young people who've lost out on their education. We also have a lot of young people who are looking for jobs. Maybe we could bring the two of them together. There's still more we can do to create employment and create new opportunities. But the last thing I would say is about the big picture. Local lockdowns do work. In Leicester it did work. We brought the rate of cases down from 160 per 100,000 to 25. That did work. And if we can make that work, that is much the best way for this country to go to avoid real hardship in this country. There have to be real lockdowns. We have to crack on with it. We have to act quickly. And I'm frustrated that some leaders in the North are not doing that. If we can make a targeted approach work, that's much the best way to go. And that is the best future for this country.
Nice show.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the 10th of May, the Prime Minister announced that the country would be easing out of lockdown, despite analysts highlighting the Prime Minister's calls were coming early, and without a vaccine and a proper track and trace system, we would fail to reduce the rise of the virus. In July, the Prime Minister set out plans for significant normality by Christmas and said people should start going back to work now if you can. He talked about opening of sports stadiums and big venues by October. In August, the Chancellor announced his flamboyant flagship policy for people to eat out and help out. At the end of August, the government launched an entire ad campaign to try and get people back into the offices for work. 3 weeks later, the government message changed to people in England should work from home if they can, and pubs and restaurants to be placed under 10 PM curfews to reduce social mixing and slow the spread of the virus. If businesses, employees and this country needed one thing that they could have hoped for during this whole crisis, which was some sort of clarity in communication, while the government and this Prime Minister failed even to provide that. For those in constituencies like mine, Madam Deputy Speaker, which have spent the last 2.5 months in further local restrictions, the impact on the local economy has been far more drastic. The unemployment rate in Bradford West is the highest in Yorkshire and Humber and 7th in the country. Figures released today by End Child Poverty show Bradford West has the highest rate of rising child poverty in Yorkshire and Humber over the last 4 years. Then the government was late planning the furlough scheme. The first reported cases of coronavirus confirmed by the Chief Medical Officer in England was on the 31st of January, and it said the Treasury did not announce plans for significant funding to support businesses and individuals until the budget on the 11th of March, and it wasn't clear to the Treasury until the following week that the furlough scheme would even be needed. The furlough scheme had gaps where people who had started their new jobs after the 11th of March were not eligible for the scheme and were missed out. The Self-Employment Income Support Scheme has failed many, especially the new businesses which have started up, as the scheme pays you based on profits made not on your actual business turnover. And the fact is that most businesses make very little, if any, profit in the first few years, yet they still have expenditures. So let me share some examples of people in my constituency. The Lights Acoustic Studio in Acoustic Audio, Clayton. According to the Musicians Union research, 87% of musicians will be earning less than $20,000 this year, well below the UK average income of $29,600. 65% are facing financial hardship right now, 47% have been forced to look for work outside of their music industry, and 36% of musicians do not have any work at all. John and Lauren, landlords of a new inn pub in Thornton in my constituency, said this today. It's an awful situation. Our turnover is massively down. The pub's appeal has changed. People feel uncomfortable coming into the pub. Government need to listen to businesses more and seriously rethink, as currently they are more at risk both from a health and safety perspective as well as economic risk. The Image Mill in Thornton, photographers have fallen through gaps as most don't have premises and were not eligible for business grants. With 15 people, wedding restrictions, there are less weddings, we've missed the wedding season and we're waiting until next year, and that has a real domino effect. Becky from Thornton finishes, and then I'll conclude my speech on what she said from Thornton Furnishing. People say the Tories are the party of business, but their catastrophic mishandling of this crisis only proves they are the party of incompetence and one that does not care for small businesses or the health and well-being of people. I can say with certainty as a business owner I will not be voting Tory at the next election. I think Becky really sums it up for the whole of my constituency. What the failures of this government, Bradford West needs more support, and I urge the Chancellor, given the right, and I said this yesterday and I'll say it again and again, Bradford West needs some targeted support, not just for its businesses, but if we are not to fail the next generation.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. These are without doubt uniquely challenging times. Every government around the world has had to shut down their economies to save lives, and the consequences and impact of having to do this have been brutal, and not just ours, but the world's economy. COVID-19 is a medical force majeure unlike any we have known in the modern era. Scientists and policymakers alike are still trying to get to grips with its medical and economic consequences. No one has the Holy Grail in these many regards. We simply do not know enough about it. But what we do know enough about is this government. It is a government that puts people and their livelihoods at its very heart. A government that has been resolute in its response to this pandemic. A government that has put in unprecedented measures to protect jobs and businesses with its economic support packages, of which my constituents are truly thankful. In my constituency alone, we have seen, here we go, 13,000 jobs protected via the furlough scheme, over 9 million to support the self-employed, over 1,000 of bounce-back loans worth over 30 million for small companies, coronavirus business interruption loan scheme, 64 loans worth over 11 million, over 15 million of business grants paid out. all from a £200 billion package of support that has been committed since the beginning of this crisis. This is a government delivering world-leading measures to protect jobs and support businesses through this crisis. We know that we are facing demand-efficient unemployment and the risk of structural unemployment. Just hearing the words recession and unemployment inspire dread, particularly seeing the harm done by welfare dependency in the past. But we should not forget is this. Before this pandemic infected our lives, it was the Conservatives who have a history of protecting, supporting and creating jobs. We saw the highest figures on record for employment in 2019. Roughly 3 million jobs were created in the decade before the pandemic, and we should not lose sight of this. Nor should we lose sight of the political opportunism of others who blame and criticise, as we've heard this afternoon from those opposite, but without their own plan. This is a government interested in responsibility and accountability because it is the right thing to do. With the Chancellor launching a £30 billion plan for jobs in July, including measures such as the £2 billion Kickstart scheme to help young people. It is very clear to me where the commitment lies, a government focused on providing new work opportunities and not pretend to people that there is always a job to go back to and not keep people in perpetuity. We cannot, after all, as a society of taxpayers, simply fund what would be the opposition's passive policy of letting people fail. This is a government prioritising support and resources to job seekers, as well as the provision of retraining for those who need it. Unlike the opposition, who seem to thrive on their perceived delights of hindsight, this is a government that thrives on foresight. As the crisis evolves, its policy evolves. This is a government that has put people's livelihoods at the very heart of the COVID-19 policy and continues to act in the national interest whilst balancing the simultaneous objectives of keeping schools open and keeping the economic engines firing and saving lives in more ways than one. The Conservatives, after all, the party of economic competence and sound financial management. This Conservative government has stood up and protected jobs, incomes and businesses with unprecedented measures. It has not cowered under the weight of this pandemic. It has not abstained under the weight of this pandemic. At its heart, enterprise to create, support and extend opportunity to as many people as it can.
Paul Bristow.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In my speech yesterday in the House, I said very clearly that something remarkable happened in my city, in Peterborough, during the recent lockdown and subsequent on the COVID pandemic. We looked after the vulnerable. We ensured those who were shielding had food and supplies. We housed and we fed our rough sleepers, thanks to restaurants and takeaways. And we came together as one city. And it made me very proud to represent that city. Not just to represent it, but also to have grown up there. But having said that, I don't want to go through that again. And Madam Deputy Speaker, it was the party opposite that would hit poor people in my city with another national lockdown. And it's for them to tell us today how many jobs in Peterborough this would cost. While the remarkable resilience of my city is down to the people of Peterborough, we didn't do it alone. The government was there to help protect jobs, protect businesses, and provide the economic security that was needed to get us through this. The government put the money where their mouth is. 15,600 jobs have been protected through the furlough scheme, 4,500 people claimed grants through the self-employment income support scheme, 2,185 bounce-back loans were awarded, 70 coronavirus business interruption loans were awarded, and business grants worth over 22 million have been awarded. But what does that mean on the ground, Madam Deputy Speaker? It means Eve Taylor, a fabulous historic skin and body care products company in Britain, have bought manufacturing capacity back in-house, expanded their business and employed more people. It means the Bottle and Board bottle shop in central Peterborough have been able to survive during this tough time. My friend Lisa Aldridge, who owns and runs Loxley Barbers, who had the dubious privilege of giving me my first haircut after lockdown, a bounce-back loan has helped them survive. My friends Billy and Tony Caturley, who run a car wash in Carr Road, who gave free car washes to NHS workers, and countless more. These are all the businesses that my office have helped. Madam Deputy Speaker, these are real people. These are real jobs, real businesses, and these people are my friends. Peterborough is a small but big city, and we depend on one another. And when we needed government supports, they were there for us. The Cultural Recovery Fund has also been a lifeline for my city. We needed support and the government listened. And it would be amiss of me not to mention some of the businesses that could not be supported, which includes those who are moving business premises just before lockdown, sole traders with not enough money, and those who paid them through dividends. And I wish we could have done more. But this was one of the most generous schemes in the world, and I'm pleased that this support is going to be there for businesses and individuals in Peterborough when we need it. The Job Support Scheme is being expanded to provide temporary and localised support to businesses whose premises are legally required to close as a direct result of these restrictions. The last thing my city needs, Madam Deputy Speaker, are these localised restrictions. They're not needed or wanted, as my city has done the right thing, and rates are still thankfully low. But it's them over there, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Labour benches will put Peterborough back into national lockdown misery, whatever our successes and whatever our individual circumstances. And I'm going to make sure, Madam Deputy Speaker, that local people in my city who know who it is who wants to restrict their freedoms, wants to take their jobs and put their businesses, make their businesses go bankrupt, when there is no reason to do so. This is typical Labour, Madam Deputy Speaker, and we're going to make sure that the people of Peterborough know who would put them back into a national lockdown misery.
Charlotte Nichols.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. At the start of this crisis, the government promised to do whatever it takes to get our country and our economy through COVID. They have broken that promise. My constituents, who have been subject to the Tier 2 restrictions for weeks now before that term was coined, are being left behind. We are in the frankly perverse situation where many pubs and hospitality venues would see more support to close than they would to stay open. This cannot continue. We need a financial package for Tier 2 local authority areas and businesses to protect jobs as a matter of urgency. With many sectors needing additional targeted support, the government have so far been unwilling to stump up anything like the amount of investment required. Sector-specific support for aviation has not been forthcoming, hurting my constituents who work at Liverpool and Manchester airports and our local supply chain. Equally, sectors with large employment multipliers, ready to create the kind of highly paid, skilled jobs our country is crying out for, are being stymied by government inaction. The nuclear sector, perhaps the most egregious example of this, directly employs almost 4,500 people in Warrington North alone, a growth of 700 on last year. They want to grow further, but the government's tardiness in publishing the Energy White Paper or making the necessary commitments to the next generation of new nuclear, including Sizewell C, is holding them back. If decisions aren't made soon, these are jobs we may lose forever at the worst possible time for our economy and the environment. And just as whole sectors of our economy are being let down by this government, so too are the lowest paid in our communities. From the new starters and newly self-employed who have been excluded from support, to those expected to live on 67% of the national minimum wage. Do the government not understand what minimum means? It's a rate independently set as the least that a person could get by on. I know that I couldn't get by on £5.84 an hour, and I don't know why anyone in this House thinks that a single one of their constituents should have to. For those not on the full rate of the national minimum wage, 67% of their salary could be as low as £3.04, less than the full rate of the minimum wage when Labour introduced it in 1998. If the government will not commit to supporting all of those on the job support scheme with a package at least as generous as furlough, the very least they could do is ensure that no one is being asked to live on less than minimum wage. The response to COVID has been the worst of all worlds. A lockdown announced too late, that was too lax, and which finished too early, ostensibly to protect the economy, though the social distancing purgatory we're in, having failed to stamp out domestic transmission, has hurt our economy far more than the national lockdown ever could. We could have modelled our response on New Zealand, who took a zero COVID strategy that meant short-term pain and enforced quarantine for all visitors, but now they have an economy that is back open and people allowed to hug their friends and families again. That should be our aspiration too.
Kevin Hollinrake.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I draw the House's attention to my register of members' interests? I am one of the 5.7 million people in this country, business people, for whom this is not a theoretical concept, but this is an existential crisis. And I listened very carefully to the Shadow Chancellor, and she talks about business confidence. I agree with her on much, actually, probably not that much in this debate, but she talks about business confidence, and one thing that really damages business confidence is when you flip-flop. And when you say on Monday that you're willing to support a local lockdown strategy, and then today you are saying it has to be a national lockdown, is totally wrong. That damages business confidence and it damages consumer confidence. One thing that has bolstered business confidence has been the unprecedented levels of support we've seen from the Treasury and the government. This is the third recession I've been through in our business. I have never seen any support like it, including obviously the years around 2008. Just touching on the national lockdown, the circuit breaker, I think we need to be honest with people. We're talking about a circuit breaker, a hit, but the reality is the sage advice says it might need multiple lockdowns, multiple circuit breakers to keep the virus at low levels. You can imagine the devastating impact on businesses and consumer confidence if you say today we might need, and that's what she has to say, she needs to be honest with the business community. This might mean, I didn't hear that in her speech, this might mean multiple lockdowns, multiple hits, multiple costs to the taxpayer and devastating impact on businesses. This will only a circuit breaker will buy 28 days to put it will back in the same place in 28 days time. That's what it says. Please be honest with the people. And what I would like to see here from the opposition is some ideas about how we keep the economy open. I haven't heard anything from the opposition about how we tackle this public health crisis while keeping the economy open. I have not heard that. And I think we should look, if we can't look to the opposition, we should look to best practice internationally. There's no European country that I'm aware of that's gone back to a national lockdown to tackle this. The best practice, of course, the leaders in managing this crisis is Germany. And they've used not just a local lockdown policy, but a sub-local lockdown policy. They closed down Gütersloh and Warendorf, 300,000 people per district. That's what we should look at. Stop looking about a wide regional lockdowns and look at sub-local lockdowns. She's talking about a national lockdown. That's the antithesis of what we're talking about. So, if I get a minute, I'm very happy to let her intervene.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I regret the fact that the member for whom I have a huge amount of respect, particularly around his campaigning on banking issues and others, that he hasn't listened to what the opposition has consistently said about test, trace and isolate. He's absolutely right about Germany. We wish we were in that situation where test, trace and isolate was working effectively. That would mean we could have a fine-grained response. We don't have it in the UK. That's why we need a reset to fix that system. He should be honest about that.
I agree with that. But it's not either or. It's not either or. Of course we need to improve test and trace. Of course we do. But that we shouldn't mean we have to lock down the entire economy. That's absolutely the wrong thing. So there's three solutions I have, Madam Deputy Speaker. The number one thing, we look at this on a super local basis. So we know that 670 is the rate of infections per 100,000 in Liverpool, 60 in parts of North Yorkshire, but this varies significantly across North Yorkshire. We look at a district-based approach that would increase the amount of ownership and responsibility local people had for managing this crisis through peer pressure and from understanding their actions would be effective. In terms of the different tiers, which I fully support, I did on Monday and I support them today. So the two higher tiers, having said that, are in a difficult situation. If you're a restaurant, or a bar or restaurant in tier 2, or a restaurant in tier 3, you are not required to close, which means you do not access the furlough support. Now, of course, I would say two things we can do. Extend the furlough support, which is a hit on the taxpayer. Or we could say, instead of coming down from 6 households per table, as we used to do, rule of 6 households as it was last week, we go to, instead of going to 1 household, we're going to 2 households. That would have a very important effect for lots of pubs and restaurants who would be then viable with that concession. And the third thing is business support. We need a new iteration of the bounce back loan schemes, the Sybil schemes, which have been so highly successful. as my honourable friend knows, we also need to make non-bank lenders part of that new tranche of business support. We need forbearance for SMEs, and also when we phase back in, we should phase back in support like VAT, move from 5 to 10%, not back to 0, back to 20%. Business rates, phase that back in, and stamp duty perhaps, we phase that back in as well. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it is a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Thirsk and Malton, who's made some interesting points, though you'll not be surprised to hear I don't agree with most of them. I'm delighted to take part in this important debate, which, regardless of what the Chancellor says, is not about cheap shots and getting at the government, because I believe that all of us in this place are united in our determination to tackle COVID-19, to see the impact on the people's health minimised and our businesses and economy prepared for recovery. And that is why, Madam Deputy Speaker, I wish to make it clear today that the Liberal Democrats are supporting this motion from the Labour Party. More than that, we would repeat our call for furlough to be extended into June of next year. I know that will cost £10 billion, but it's what the country needs and a drop in the ocean compared to what will have to be spent if we get this wrong. It also needs to be reformed, to be expanded, to include the 3 million people in this country who are still waiting for any help from this government. That's not good enough. More than that, I would also support the Labour Party's call to this government to take on board the scientific advice and bring forward a 2 to 3 week circuit breaker. I know that the thought of us all having to endure that again, particularly businesses, is not what any of us wants to hear. My constituents in Edinburgh West, like individuals, companies, families up and down this country, have already endured unimaginable stress about their futures and their health, and some very real hardship. But the situation that we face now and they face now could have been avoided if this government had used the summer to really create a world-beating test and trace system. Not one they tell us is world-beating, but one which is. I am one of those people that my honourable friend from North East 5 talked about earlier, who jumps from one app to the other when I travel, and worry about the fact that I may be on the wrong app when I need to be traced, and how will they find me? A circuit breaker moment must be used to ensure test and trace can and does deliver. It also has to provide the economic support for a sustained and fast economic kickstart when the circuit breaker period is over. But let's be clear, it's not the virus which is solely responsible or to blame for where we are. It's the government's incompetence, its inability to use that time that I mentioned that it had over the summer to use it effectively. We need a strategy, a package which sets out not just the support available, but a plan for recovery, a route map out of this, certainty that every sector of the economy craves, which brings me back to the extension to furlough. The Chancellor said we need to take responsibility, and he's absolutely right. But the government is not leading, they're responding. There's no strategy or consistency, there's no improvement. What we have instead is an astonishing chop and change, knee-jerk reaction to support for business. We were understanding in March. We'd not faced this before, but now we're 7 months down the line, 7 months, and enough is enough. 635,000 cases, more than 43,000 deaths. The mourning, the job losses, the suffering people have already had to face. Unprecedented doesn't have to mean impossible. The Chancellor asked us to look at the numbers. Well, we've learned this week the economy has grown less than half of what was expected, and the Bank of England has warned of 3 million unemployed, which will only be exacerbated by leaving the EU without a trade deal. And just in case the front bench is going to think that because I'm Scottish I'm a nationalist, I'm not. I'm not. And this is not about saying the Scottish Government is wonderful, because it's not, even though it says so. It's about asking for what the country needs. And
order. Anna McMorrin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the member for Edinburgh West. The UK Government has failed, spectacularly failed, to use the time that we had to get a grip of this virus. It needn't have been this way. The UK government have failed to work collaboratively with all 4 nations to implement a coherent national strategy, putting people first and protecting lives. And this, let me tell you, is not for want of trying by the Welsh Labour government, whose repeated efforts of cooperation have been ignored. They have failed to produce a joined-up and effective test, trace and isolate system in England to halt the spread and shield the vulnerable, where this Tory government has squandered millions on failed attempts by companies such as Serco. The Welsh Labour government, in contrast, introduced test, trace and protect delivered by local health boards and local authorities with an over 90% success rate. And when nations across the world, like Germany, were extending and strengthening support to protect jobs and livelihoods and provide the level of flexibility that was needed, this Treasury was whittling away economic support, reducing the furlough scheme and failing to support the excluded 3 million. I recently asked my constituents in Cardiff North what they thought of the current crisis and how they were managing, and the overwhelming majority of businesses who took part were worried beyond belief. They're worried about their future. There needs to be a flexible economic approach which truly supports our businesses, families and people's livelihoods, without fear for their future, reforming the job support scheme, incentivising employers to keep staff on rather than letting them go. This is what constituents and businesses in Cardiff North are crying out for, an economic package which allows people to isolate if they have to, provide security and peace of mind. Businesses in Cardiff North, such as Tom at Mr Brightside's Cafe in Llandaff North, Alwyn and Iechyd in Whitchurch, the fantastic Birch Grove pub in Birch Grove run by the brilliant Welsh Brains Brewery, and Sue and Laura at Cellar Cafe in Llanishen, the self-employed, the local traders, the local people who support local jobs are the heart of our community. They have all told me what they need is that sustained economic support. And we know the Welsh Labour government has already brought forward a wave of measures to protect jobs and livelihoods, the most generous package of support for businesses for SMEs anywhere in the UK, and a resilience fund supported by 13,000 companies and helped secure 100,000 jobs in Wales. And what we're seeing, Madam Deputy Speaker, earlier in the debate the Chancellor called what he's doing leadership. Really? My constituents don't see leadership. They see incoherent messaging, confusion, a Chancellor worried more about maintaining his brand than showing real leadership, which means changing tact even when it's uncomfortable to do so and in the national interest. A cabinet at war with itself, protecting health or protecting the economy, which fails to grasp that the two must go hand in hand. This is not leadership. People are suffering, livelihoods ruined, loved ones lost. We need a reset, so stop playing games and put people's lives first.
Order. Sam Tarry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This was never going to be easy. No government was ever going to put everything right. But as millions of people are facing a prospect of Christmas without a job, the facts do speak for themselves. Britain's economic downturn is now the worst in Europe, and the OBR has forecast that unemployment would reach 11.9%, and that consequence of extreme poverty set to double. In the first half of this year alone, the UK has endured the worst recession of any G7 country, with GDP falling by more than 22%. We are now left mired in the worst recession in our history. Just this week, IPPR published a report which revealed that within 2 million jobs are at risk, that the job support scheme will only save 10%. And that's because the scheme in its current guise simply doesn't incentivise businesses to retain their staff. Other countries, such as Germany and Denmark, have offered far more comprehensive packages that actually save a significant number of jobs. That report was followed yesterday by the announcement that redundancies are up by a record 114,000 in this quarter, the highest unemployment rate for 3 years, leading the Office for National Statistics to revise its own estimate of the current employment rate to 4.5%. And that's why it's incredibly worrying that the recent report, that the support package unveiled by the Chancellor fell well short of what is required. Just days before the furlough scheme ends, we forecast that between 10 and 20% of those currently on furlough are likely to end up unemployed when the scheme ends. In my constituency alone, that means 4,500 people in Ilford South losing their jobs as a minimum. And all of this at a time when support for the self-employed collapses next month to just 20% of profits, down from 70% currently. In my own constituency, Ilford South, more than 33,000 voters in that constituency are on some form of job support, be it furlough, self-employed income support scheme. And as a result of the pandemic, that's more than 1/3 of the entire constituency. Madam Deputy Speaker, what am I supposed to tell those workers who are already struggling to put food on the table for their families? How many more people have to lose their jobs before this government gets a grip on the health and jobs crisis? Is the Chancellor honestly saying that after decades of austerity that the infrastructure is in place to retrain all those who have lost jobs? Does he even know how long it would take a waiter who lost their job in a shop in Ilford to retrain as a Python computer coder? The government's new skills training initiative won't even be ready until April. This government had its head in the clouds. It should come as no surprise, therefore, there's a significant public backing for a new way of running our economy. A recent Survation poll found that 74% of the public are in favour of the wealthiest in our society paying more tax. I'm sure members of the opposite side of this House will want to know that 64% of Conservative voters were also in favour, while YouGov found that a staggering 94% of the UK public believe there needs to be a change from the status quo of the pre-pandemic economy. This government is simply burying its head in the sand and carrying on as though we're not still in the middle of a global pandemic. It's just simply not the answer. As we learned in the first wave, if we'd locked down the country just 1 week earlier, we'd have a death toll that would have been half. The Prime Minister on Monday suggested not only very high-risk areas will get additional funding for local track and trace. I wonder whether we therefore agree we need to fix test and trace right across this country. And given in Redbridge, my constituency has one of the worst infection rates in London, time is simply running out for the health and economic crisis. The UK government has lost control of this virus, lost control of the message, and is no longer even following scientific advice. That's why Labour is calling for a circuit breaker lockdown, coupled with the economic package and measures that need to be put in place to support and lift our people and stop another generation from going into poverty.
Beth Wintler.
Thank you, Deputy Madam Speaker. The COVID pandemic has exposed and exacerbated an already broken economic system, rigged in favour of the wealthy while eroding workers' rights and remuneration. This system is broken. My constituency of Cynon Valley is a case in point. The local authorities endured 90 million of Tory government cuts since 2010 under austerity. There is 23% of the population currently living in poverty, while child poverty rates are even higher at 35%. Alongside this, we've been one of the areas hardest hit by the coronavirus, like the poorest communities elsewhere in the United Kingdom. We've had one of the highest rates of COVID and deaths from COVID in Wales, and at certain points one of the highest in the UK. Tory austerity measures have left people in my constituency poorer and therefore more susceptible to this virus. Since the 1980s, we've experienced the demise of traditional industries, and unemployment rates have risen sharply recently. A quarter of the workforce has been furloughed, and workers are fearful for their future. Figures for universal credit claimants have almost doubled this year and are above the UK average. The future is also bleak for our young people, with the number of benefit claimants doubled between March and July this year. The UK government's original furlough scheme was welcome and did provide a lifeline for many businesses, but it fell short of what was required. The Chancellor's belatedly announced job support scheme is woefully inadequate and is only applicable to certain groups. We have done things differently in Wales, and the Labour-led Welsh Government has put in place an extremely generous package of support for businesses, the best in the UK. And this includes the Economic Resilience Fund, which is providing further grants to enable businesses to adapt to post-COVID realities, to support the foundational economy and assist businesses adversely affected by the local lockdown. But the purse strings remain with the UK Government, and that places severe constraints on what we can achieve in Wales. The current funding arrangements between central government and Wales are insufficient to meet our needs. We need a genuine four-nation partnership approach to eradicate not only the virus from our country, and it can be done because other countries such as New Zealand have done it, but also to develop the right economic strategy and end the poverty trap that damages so many communities and individuals, both financially and in terms of health. We need to end the dead hand of financial inflexibility from the UK Government so the Welsh Government can carry over monies from one year to the next and ease borrowing limits. The current situation is not an inevitable consequence of the pandemic. It is a result of a political choice. With the UK entering the worst recession of any OECD country, with estimates as high as 4 million unemployed, action is needed now, and I urge the Government to stand by its commitment to do whatever it takes and provide an economic package that will cater for everyone. This could include reforming the job support scheme to reimburse everyone at 80% of wages or higher, providing sector-specific support, provide support for specific groups, end precarious working arrangements. And alongside this, we desperately need welfare reform to provide a safety net, and we can begin by reversing the 30 billion cuts to the social security budget since 2010. And we can afford this by taxing wealth. It's estimated that if wealth were taxed at the same rate as income tax, it would raise £174 billion a year. In 2008, the government paid £500 billion to bail out the banks. We can do this, if the political will is there to do it. So does this government have the political will to act to help people in communities like mine, or will it continue to help their millionaire cronies with juicy contracts so they can profit from this pandemic?
Order. Carolyn Harris.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it's a pleasure to speak after my honourable friend from the member for Cannon Valley. Yesterday, I received a message from a beauty salon owner, and she told me 5 out of 8 appointments cancelled today due to clients being in contact with someone who may have coronavirus. And incidentally, before either of the members on the bench opposite start patting themselves on the back, that it's the track and trace system, it wasn't. It's all linked to a local outbreak in a local pub. This woman is a successful business owner who is now left wondering how long she can sustain this level of cancellation without financial support. Having only been open for 2 months following the extended forced closure of the industry, she has been attempting to a new norm, which is already considerably less than prior to the pandemic. The spike in cases means that this month she's looking at being down 20% on that new norm. She's struggling, she's worried, and she's asking when the government is going to recognise this industry that has been constantly overlooked and undervalued throughout the pandemic and offer them some financial support. And my response to her is that I'm wondering the very same thing. Over the last 6 months, I have asked on countless occasions for support for this industry. I've sat in this chamber while the Prime Minister openly sniggered when asked a question by one of his own MPs about supporting these businesses. His trademark flippancy and ridiculing of a sector struggling to survive is not welcome and has left some 370,000 employees, mostly women, feeling belittled, undervalued and angry. As co-chair of the Beauty, Aesthetics and Wellbeing APPG, with my good friend, the member for Bradford South, I've heard heartbreaking stories of job losses, of businesses collapsing and of financial insecurity for those that work in this sector. I have asked in this chamber for the beauty and wellbeing sector to be taken seriously and to be treated with the same respect as other industries. I've written to ministers, to the Chancellor, to the Prime Minister, and I've asked for a support package to help these businesses survive. But I feel my pleas have constantly fallen on deaf ears. This is a multi-billion-pound industry that's currently on its knees. It's great to see the Chancellor outlining the money that will be available to support other businesses to help them survive. And I wholeheartedly support this. But where's the help for our beauty and well-being sector? The hospitality and leisure sectors have now had a VAT reduction to 5% for more than 3 months. It's been a real boost to industries that have struggled due to closures at the first peak of the pandemic and reduced income as they started to reopen. So, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I ask again, can this VAT reduction be extended to the hair, beauty, spa and wellness sectors? Can they too be given this financial support to help them survive with the further measures looking increasingly likely? And if not, can the Minister ask the Chancellor please to tell me, and the 370,000 people that earn their living from the sector, why not?
Taiwo Owatemi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I am pleased to be speaking in the debate today. So yesterday, my honourable friend for Oxford East raised a pertinent question to the Chancellor regarding the economic support available to individuals and businesses in areas subject to additional public health restrictions. We have repeatedly spoken in this House about the Chancellor being out of touch with financial needs of the businesses, employees and employers within our constituencies, and he has proven us right yet again. So today I ask, what good is the job support scheme to businesses in Coventry North West if it doesn't provide crucial support to employees within Tier 1 and Tier 2 areas of lockdown? If businesses have chosen to close due to coronavirus restrictions, I'll tell him it does absolutely nothing. The Chancellor's sink or swim approach to a job support scheme is letting my constituents who won't be able to access it down. The job support scheme provides less security to employees than the furlough scheme. My constituents will go from receiving 80% of their wages to just 66% on the job support scheme. And that's only if people can work a third of their stipulated hours. If they can't work, well, they don't receive anything. What does the Chancellor think will happen to people on low income and people on 0-hour contract? Well, I'll tell him. It will push them further into poverty and possibly into financial destitution. Full financial support will only apply to businesses in regions under a Tier 3 lockdown who are forced to close. This scheme the Chancellor has called a safety net for businesses. Will not be a safety net for businesses who choose to shut down, nor will it be a safety net for businesses who are told to close by local public health authorities. Now, I don't know what the Chancellor considers to be a safety net, but this is not it. The financial support offered by this government will do nothing for those who have been excluded from support from the very start of this pandemic, and will do nothing for businesses that aren't forced to close but need to. This isn't fair, and it just isn't right. With HMRC estimating that there are 700,000 fewer people on payroll since the beginning of the pandemic, and economists expecting unemployment to increase, what is the Chancellor doing to safeguard employees? We have already established that many people will fall through the gap within the new financial scheme on offer. The Bank of England has also estimated that unemployment rate may as well be 7.5% by the end of 2020. In Coventry North West, unemployment claimant figures have risen to 4,815, and I fear that this could be more. The Chancellor needs to ensure economic support goes hand in hand with the imposition of local restrictions. We can't have a one-size-fits-all tier system. It is doomed to fail from the very start. If Labour were in government, we would put in place a job recovery scheme that fixes the problem with the government scheme so that employers can keep more staff on rather than having to let people go. This ensures one-to-one. This ensures that no one on the scheme falls into poverty and opens to all businesses impacted by the restriction. A tightly designed and targeted scheme would also ensure money was spent where it is most needed. Thank you.
Eric Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady, and it's with a somewhat of a sense of déjà vu that I rise with the Minister on the front bench, having had exchange with him in Westminster Hall yesterday on financial support for the events industry. I don't intend to go over the same ground today. I'm sure you'll be glad to hear, but obviously, as with so many issues, the support that has not been there for those in the events industry does extend beyond, and as I say, we did cover much of that yesterday. But these are businesses that we just can't abandon. Businesses who are successful and who will be successful again very soon, and where support that could be made available could actually see them over the hill. We can't pretend that 22% of the wage bill is going to be even close to enough for employers to keep on staff, where many are in a worse position than they were in March, and when restrictions are still preventing them from carrying out the business that they would mainly be doing. Many fantastic high turnover businesses like Saltire Hospitality in my own constituency have seen the major events that they normally supply cancelled and simply unable to take place during the COVID pandemic, and they've changed their business, they've pivoted, they've tried different ideas again and again to adapt to changing circumstances, and they will have a full diary when events and conferences are able to get up and running again. But where's the support from this government to get them there? Successful and viable businesses like this are put at real risk if the government fails to listen. I do welcome the recognition that some extension of support was needed for wages, albeit that it was late in the day, and I do welcome the continuation of the 5% VAT rate for hospitality until the 31st of March, although as my honourable friend, the member for Glasgow East, suggested, this is something that we would like to see far more extended. Sadly, support is simply not enough to halt the frightening tsunami of job losses that we can all see on the horizon. Self-employed have all been abandoned, but 70% of profitable placement, just 20% now. And there's still nothing for the 3 million excluded from support at all. Financial support is half-hearted when we need the government to stay fully committed to do as the Chancellor said and do whatever it takes. The Labour Party today is asking the government to go further, and I support that. The Scottish Government is already taking action to plug the gaps in support where they can, providing tailored packages above and beyond the Barnett consequentials, including the new £40 million fund for firms that are having to close. They're finding resources from a very limited budget and spending it wisely. This is something that this government, which is not best known for, could do much to learn from. And you wonder how many businesses could have been comfortably supported with the botched billions that have been blown in dodgy private contracts with Tory cronies and the unnecessary costs of building the Brexit border. However welcome Scottish Government action is, without serious rethinking of the job support scheme, they're papering cracks in a seawall just before the tsunami hits. If this government won't act, they should provide the Scottish Government with the fiscal levers that Scotland needs to take the right decisions to protect jobs, lives, wherever necessary. The decisions on available support are not carved in stone. They're made up by a small group of people with big responsibilities on their shoulders. It is a political choice, and it's a short-sighted one from this government at the moment from the actions that they're not taking. The Scottish Government calculates extending furlough would save 61,000 jobs in Scotland. The good news is that these are decisions that can be rethought, and I would urge the Government to do so for the sake of all our futures.
Davis Jones.
Diolch yn fawr, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it is an honour to follow the member for Midlothian. I share a lot of his concerns, and I think it is vital that we recognise that the numbers often quoted in this place relate to actual real people with real bills to pay and with real children to look after. The Chancellor, given his absence yesterday, may not be aware that my local authority of Rhondda and Taff has been under local coronavirus restrictions for some weeks now, so I can speak with specific experience. Hundreds of people across Pontypridd feel utterly failed by the Chancellor and this government. Colleagues across the House will know that this is not the first financial hardship that my community has faced this year. Pontypridd, along with the member, my friend for Cynon Valley, and the member for the Rhondda's communities were hit with some of the worst flooding ever recorded only 8 months ago. Storm Dennis decimated parts of our constituencies earlier this year, and the Prime Minister has said that funds would be passported to help us rebuild. Where is that money? And it just shows you how much stock can be placed in the promise from this government. All of these months later, and we and our communities are still waiting. This is absolutely disgraceful and shows just how little care this government has for the people of Wales. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government is still pursuing a one-size-fits-all approach to protecting jobs during this pandemic. The Labour Party has now been calling for a sector-specific support deal for months now, and still this government hasn't accepted responsibility and hasn't put a plan in place to support these industries. We know that the aviation sector is facing specific and substantial challenges because of the virus. In Pontypridd, major employers including GE Aviation in Nantgarw and British Airways in Llantrisant have sadly been forced to make redundancies. Across this country, 1.6 million people's jobs and livelihoods rely on the aviation sector. We cannot just let these jobs disappear. The coach industry too is facing specific challenges as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. Like aviation, this is a seasonal industry that is very reliant on tourism. Industry experts estimate up to 4 in 10 companies could be bust, and 27,000 jobs could be lost if no support is made available. This will hit communities hard, as many of these companies are family-owned small businesses, like Edwards Coaches and Ferris's Coaches in my own constituency. It really doesn't have to be this way. This government has the opportunity to save jobs with sector-specific support packages, but instead has decided to proceed with an economic support package that clearly isn't fit for purpose. The High Street is also feeling the strain. Just this week, the group that owns Peacocks, a significant employer in my constituency, announced that they are appointing administrators. Across this country, this puts 24,000 jobs at risk, and other well-known High Street brands are feeling the strain too. River Island recently closed their store in Pontypridd High Street after being doubly hit, first by flooding from Storm Dennis and then by the coronavirus pandemic. And Pontypridd High Street is sadly not alone. And then there's still the problem of all the people who've been left out of the government support altogether. Earlier this week, I asked the Minister about support for people who've been excluded from the government support schemes, and his response said that the government had covered the issue. Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have to say that the 3 million people who have been excluded from UK government support during the coronavirus pandemic don't feel like this issue has been covered at all. When will this government take some responsibility? You cannot govern with 11th hour announcements and leaks to the press. People in areas under local restrictions need clarity and guidance, not slapdash announcements that haven't even been thought through. I urge the Chancellor and the Minister to deeply consider their priorities going forward, because our constituents all deserve a secure economic future, and people across Wales deserve better than to be consistently forgotten and betrayed by this government.
Blue Eagle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government has already conceded that fighting the spread of this dangerous COVID-SARS virus in our country requires extraordinary levels of state action and support. But now, just as the fight is intensifying, it's clear that they've lost their nerve. We're not only battling this deadly virus, the Prime Minister is fighting his own libertarian instincts and the right-wing ideologues in his own party. They're opposed to the collective state action which is necessary to save lives and mitigate the damage from the pandemic. The delay this fight caused in March left us with a double whammy of the highest per capita death toll in Europe and on top of the largest economic hit in the G7. And now this unforgivable dereliction of duty looks like it's happening again. As the Prime Minister dithers, the virus spreads. His failure to take timely and firm action will cost more lives and wreak more damage on our economy. As he courts his mutinous backbenchers and abandons the science to keep them sweet, all the warning signs are flashing red again. He's behind the curve and he knows it. And since the Sage Minutes were published on Monday night, we all know it too. The government has lost the trust it needs to lead the fight against this deadly threat. Its partisan, high-handed behaviour has made it worse, excluding Parliament completely, constant briefings to the media, an obsession with outsourcing and centralisation, which has caused the failure of test and trace and the scandal of PPE supplier contracts to Tory donors. And now, we will do whatever it takes, has turned into the inadequate furlough light proposals which the Chancellor has recently come up with. Just as the virus returns, he's packed up the safety net. For my constituents in Wallasey, who are now in Tier 3 and facing a local lockdown, vital support disappears at the end of the month. In Wirral, 31,000 people are still on furlough and it will disappear at the end of the month just as the virus comes roaring back. What replaces it is completely inadequate, as the Chancellor knows only too well. And those who are losing their jobs or their business don't want a lecture from the Chancellor about how much is already spent. Those who are excluded completely from this support, in the first place, the freelancers, some of the self-employed, they don't want that lecture either. They want a government which will recognise the hardship the pandemic has caused and be there to help. The least the government could have done was to repurpose the 40 million in unspent support allocated to the Liverpool City region, which is now in Tier 3, to support local businesses. But just again today, the Chancellor has refused even this modest request. Those forced to self-isolate to stop the spread of the virus need the support to do so, and not to have to choose between feeding their family and obeying the rules. Wirral Borough Council, which has been in the forefront of the fight against the virus, have not been reimbursed for what it's cost, and like many other local authorities, they're teetering on the verge of bankruptcy. So what do we need? We need an increase in generosity of the furlough light scheme. It's got to pay more to those whose jobs are affected. We need wider eligibility. It's got to go to businesses who are affected, not only those who close. We need to include the excluded, which means freelancers and the self-employed. And we need to pay adequate sick pay for those forced to isolate. If we don't do this, Madam Deputy Speaker, the virus will roar back, and the economic cost will, in the end, be far greater, and the cost in lives will be unbearable.
Leila Moran.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today I want to focus on the forgotten. Those who have been forgotten by this government in my constituency, but also right across the country. And there are 3 million who are excluded, not to mention the 4 million who are now reliant on the flawed universal credit system. In Oxford, West and Abingdon, the claimant rate has increased by 255% since March. And what scares me about all of this is that here we are again. Here we are again. They all suffered when we went into lockdown. We had meetings after meetings where we were raising these issues with this government. And we were told that if we do this, if we clump together and we clap for our frontline workers every Thursday and we will get through this. And yet here we are with now a 3-tier system, what I think is inevitably going to lead to another lockdown, because what we're hearing is that the government has started to abandon listening to the scientists and are instead following this strange balancing act where they're trying to present it as if it was Goldilocks, the best of both worlds, when in fact we have some of the highest case numbers per capita in Europe and some of the poorest performing economic metrics. This is the worst of all possible worlds, not the best. And from my constituency, like many others, there are just some horrific stories. A director of a small gym in my constituency, who is a small company, pays himself by PAYE and dividends, and is petrified of seeing what's happening in the north with the closing of gyms and wondering what's going to happen now. Is there going to be continuing no safety net? And he's worried about going out of business altogether. You know, these are the 99% of businesses in our country that form the backbone of our economy. And once they close, as the Minister and the Chancellor will well know, it's much more difficult for them to start up again. I have a constituent who is working 2 jobs because neither of them is enough to pay the cost of living. And she gets nothing now because 47% of her income is from being self-employed. But the thing that's most striking about her correspondence with me, Madam Deputy Speaker, and also of my constituent Christopher, who works in the creative arts industry, is that real sense of fear and deteriorating mental health. If you read the emails from the beginning of March to now, you can see that they are tetchy. They then apologise to me for the tone of their emails. And it's not me that they should be apologising to. It's the Chancellor and the Minister and this government who should be apologising to them because of the stress that they are going under. Because for Christopher, he's not earned a penny since March. And the point he makes is he has spent his whole life paying his taxes. He has a contract with this country. And throughout this whole period, he feels that, and yes, I totally agree, we need to improve furlough, we need to have sector by sector bailouts if we need to. But for Christopher, he's received absolutely nothing. He's supporting his wife, his 2 children. He's paid his taxes the whole of his life. And he feels completely abandoned. And now he is talking about feeling depressed and anxious and the long-term effect that the lack of support from this government is going to have on people's mental health is one of the consequences of this pandemic that I don't think we are taking seriously enough. So I hope for those constituents and others across the country who are hearing these speeches from the opposition benches at least, they know they are not being forgotten, even if they might be being excluded by this government. And all I would like to say is a plea on their behalf. Please, this is not dealt with. Yes, there are support packages for others, but it hasn't reached them.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's an honour to follow the Honourable Member for Oxford West and Abingdon, who I agree with on so many of the points that she makes. In my constituency of Jarrow, people have been living under local restrictions for over a month without any clear support package in place. The Chancellor's indecisiveness has left workers and businesses all across constituencies, and particularly in all areas under local restrictions, in complete limbo, often confused by ever-changing rules and regulations. And it's no secret that wealthy areas, including the Chancellor's own parliamentary seat of Richmond, are avoiding lockdown despite higher COVID-19 rates than less wealthy areas that are subject to restrictions. It begs the question, if London and the south of England had been asked to live under the same restrictions as those implemented in the north, would the government have found new strategies a long time ago? This utterly stinks of classism and serial incompetence at the heart of this government. And the empty benches opposite tell me how much this government aren't listening. The Chancellor has made a U-turn of sorts, but people in my constituency have already suffered, and for many this has come far too late. It feels to many like an intentional managed decline. This isn't levelling up, it's levelling down. Take the example of Kieran, a bar manager in my constituency who got in touch, heartbroken that his bar has turned from a hiring business to a firing business in the weeks since the local restrictions were introduced. Kieran's business saw infection rates staying stable for the 2 months after reopening. So like many of us, he's at a loss as to understand why the hospitality industry is being made a scapegoat for the rise in cases when no concrete evidence has been produced by the government to prove that this is the case, despite this being repeatedly asked for by all sides of this House. There's nothing new here for the self-employed, nothing again for those who have been excluded from the start, and nothing for businesses that aren't forced to close but who are suffering because of their local restrictions. In fact, some local hospitality businesses and others have told me that they would rather be in Tier 3 than Tier 2 due to the lack of financial support. The Chancellor's chaotic habit of trying to fix problems of his own making at the last possible minute is costing jobs and causing chaos, and the UK is on course for a 1980s-style jobs crisis, and the Chancellor's name is all over it. I fully support the proposals by the Shadow Front Bench that would put in place a job recovery scheme that fixes the problems that so many employers can keep more staff on. If the Chancellor's current plans are not reformed, millions of people will be pushed into unemployment, and yet the government will still be required, of course, to offer financial support through many benefits like the inadequate universal credit. Households will feel the squeeze, and the prospects for recovery will be hampered by a lack of income and low confidence amongst British households. The legacy from the last period of mass unemployment already casts a shadow over the British economy, particularly in the north, and I can only imagine what the legacy of the Prime Minister and this government will look like. Nobody is asking for the furlough scheme to go on forever, but workers and jobs must be protected if we are to return to any kind of normality when we finally defeat this virus. Put the correct levels of support in place, make the correct political decisions, and save jobs by supporting all businesses, no matter the size or the sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow my fellow North East MP. The UK has one of the highest COVID-19 death rates in the world, thousands of lives lost, and families have been torn from their loved ones far too soon. The UK is also on track to have one of the worst recessions, with millions out of work and people looking for employment in the most hostile conditions imaginable. Yesterday it was announced that the UK unemployment rate had surged to its highest level for over 3 years at 4.5%. The disastrous mix of the pandemic and the Tory incompetence continues to decimate our jobs market. But while the national picture is devastating, what is happening in North East England is utterly catastrophic. We have amongst the highest mortality rate for deaths involving COVID-19, and our unemployment rate has soared to 6.6%, the worst in the UK. As Niamh Concorin of the North East Chamber of Commerce said yesterday, the North East now finds itself with the highest unemployment rate, the lowest employment rate and the lowest average hours worked of all British regions. She went on, although the government amendments to the job support scheme offer some support for our region in the event of tighter restrictions, it doesn't go far enough. For thousands of families, their income is precarious, dwindling or has disappeared. And new child poverty statistics released today by the End Child Poverty Coalition show that the North East has seen the biggest rise in child poverty. In my own and next door constituency of Stockton South, the proportion of children living in poverty has risen to 34% and 29% respectively, with others in the Tees Valley higher still. These aren't empty statistics, Madam Deputy Speaker, but represent thousands of living, breathing children plunged into poverty as a result of poorly paid jobs or no jobs at all for their families. The Tees Valley is hemorrhaging jobs. 12,565 have been lost since March, and thousands more are now destined for the scrap heap, thanks to the Tory response. Yet businesses in Tier 2 lockdown, like those in my constituency, have no safety net whatsoever. They're not legally mandated to close, yet we know for a fact that many of them will, and many of them won't open again. They will have few, if any, customers, but they will get no proper support from the government. Simon Longbottom, CEO of the Stonegate Pub Company that has 10 pubs in my constituency, said, "Whilst we are continually working to protect jobs, with every new instruction from government, our delicate business balance fractures further." Even businesses that are mandated to close will only get partial support for wages. This could only mean another wave of job losses. Across the Tees Valley in the North East, we're crying out for serious and sustained economic investment. Our Tory Metro Mayor promised job creation for the Tees Valley, but he's spent £100,000 on each job he's created in the last 3 years. Then there's Hoochingate. The Tory Mayor proudly donned his hard hat to announce he's spending £1 million on a new gate to an industrial estate with few jobs, if any. That £1 million, Madam Deputy Speaker, could have provided 100 vulnerable businesses with a £10,000 lifeline and probably saved many of them from closure. Sadly, it's been spent on a gate, and there's no protection scheme for jobs. For every job announced in the last 3 years, 5 have been lost in the last 6 months. We need a serious vision from the government, one that isn't just about creating a few eye-wateringly expensive new jobs, but about protecting the good jobs that already exist. If the government doesn't act, not only will we see the poor suffer even more in our communities like mine in Stockton North, but many families who have never experienced poverty in their lives will be experiencing it for the first time. That is not a place we as a country want to be going.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Over the last 7 months, we've obviously had an extremely difficult time for individuals, families and communities right across our country. So I want to start by paying tribute to those in my constituency who have kept our economy and our community going. Key workers and community groups have pulled together in an incredibly resourceful and compassionate way to get us through these difficult times. While local businesses have turned their hands to manufacturing PPE at the drop of a hat and showcased an amazing amount of skill and flexibility, it's been an inspiration to witness. Yet many of my Aberavon constituents have been badly let down by the cracks in government schemes or by incoherent UK government communications. For instance, holidays are not seen as a reasonable excuse to leave a lockdown area, yet because the flights are going ahead, some travel companies and insurers are refusing to give refunds or pay out. One constituent of mine lost £1,800 on a trip to Turkey by trying to do the right thing in staying home, and another faced hardship over a trip to Portugal. I'd like to hear what the government's doing to apply pressure on these firms and to compensate customers where the firm has gone bust. There's also still a lack of support for self-employed people during local lockdowns. while many of Aberavon's pubs and hospitality firms are also increasingly concerned that they're not receiving sufficient compensation. The Chancellor needs to recognise these problems and listen to our front bench, who have been constructive and consistent throughout this process. Labour has stated clearly that the government should put in place a job recovery scheme that fixes the problems with the government schemes so that employers can keep more staff on rather than having to let people go, that ensures that no one on the scheme falls into poverty, and that is open to all businesses impacted by the restrictions. We need the government to recognise the large number of holes in its recovery plan and for it to actively strive to fill in those holes rather than simply ticking the boxes and turning away. That's why Labour is stating clearly that a 2 to 3 week circuit breaker lockdown should be accompanied by the reopening of the government's closed £1.3 billion fund, using the underspend to support businesses in need. Madam Deputy Speaker, by far the biggest employer in my constituency is the Port Talbot Steelworks. Yet Tata Steel has fallen through the cracks in government schemes and is yet to receive a single penny of COVID-related support. Steel workers are key workers. The steel industry is continuing to operate and to serve Britain through the current crisis as we look to rebuild our economy. It is the foundation of our entire manufacturing sector. We need our steel, but the industry can only get through this crisis with urgent support from government. Make no mistake about it, steel underpins our entire manufacturing sector, from defence to aerospace to automotive to construction. It builds resilience and reliance into our economy. It is also far greener to make steel in the UK than to import it, and there are some fantastic projects such as Specific happening in my constituency, which is about creating photovoltaic cells with a steel-based film. The government must offer long-term support to steel in the form of a sector deal, such as the one that aerospace and construction have. But they must first of all offer immediate short-term support to get us through this crisis. The message is clear. We need our steel. Steel is a 21st century industry that forms the backbone of our economy, and there can be no post-pandemic economic recovery without a strong and healthy steel industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday I received the latest claimant figures for my constituency. Liverpool Riverside's rate of claimants has doubled since the pandemic began in March. The joblessness in my constituency is 1 in 5, including those, like many of the excluded UK members, who don't feature as they are unable to claim any support whatsoever. And now that Liverpool has been declared a Tier 3 zone, our leisure, gyms and hospitality sectors are being forced to close. Across Liverpool, there are approximately 30,000 people employed in this sector, and all face at least 4 weeks without work. The job support scheme offers less support than comparable schemes in other countries, and it will only provide 67% of earnings and will force many people into poverty. And the point has been made this week by colleagues that bills, rent, food costs are not reducing by 67% to match this. And for those who are self-employed and reliant on the hospitality and leisure industries for business, their support reduces to just 10%. I watched the interview with Natalie Hayward on ITV this week, owner of The Leaf and Oh Me, Oh My, 2 of our city's leading hospitality independent, and it was heartbreaking to watch her under such despair over the fact that, having fought hard to recover from the first lockdown, she is now faced with losing the iconic businesses she has built up, and worse, possibly having to lay off her staff. And she is far from alone. Another interview with an owner, Lunya, a business that has paid over 10 million in taxes in its 10-year history, employs dozens of local people, has adapted the businesses to ensure survival throughout this first lockdown, and he now risks losing his business and his home. Yellow Sub, one of the best-loved children's indoor play areas, one of the last businesses allowed to open, missed the busy summer season and will now miss the half-term, putting their business in jeopardy, axing jobs and more people without work. Many of these businesses access the government grants in the first lockdown, and they saved their businesses, reopening even on a limited capacity basis in September. This unforeseen enforced lockdown without that support has left them reeling and looking at the bleakest of futures. Liverpool's hospitality and leisure industries are critical to our economy as one of the top 5 UK destinations, the sector contributes £5 billion to the Merseyside economy and sustains 50,000 jobs. Forcing this entire sector to close for an indefinite period without the financial support available, as in the first lockdown, will decimate our city and our region. And I must pay thanks to our Metro Mayor Steve Rotherham and the 6 local authority leaders for pulling together a 40 million support scheme for this sector, without which we would undoubtedly be facing a domino effect of shutdowns in our city centre. But we need more. The local restrictions grant scheme won't provide enough to cover the overheads of most of our small independent businesses, the ones that make Liverpool so unique. I call on the government to repay the city the unspent discretionary grant fund and allow us to invest in our economy. I'm a very proud Scouser and privileged to represent such a resilient city that always fights back to protect its people. But let's have a fair fight. Give us the money we need to protect jobs and livelihoods and keep our economy going, and we will respond by supporting our businesses, our workforces, and come back stronger. Thank you.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Never has a relationship between the health of a nation and the wealth of a nation been laid quite so bare as these past 6 months. We were promised world beating by this Prime Minister and his Health Secretary, and we got it. Not only has the UK seen the worst death rate per 100,000, but it's also seen the worst economic impact of G20 nations. In response to calls from Labour and the TUC, the government wisely introduced the furlough scheme, and the initial financial support from the government was a lifeline to many of my constituents. 16,000 people in Warwick and Leamington were furloughed. Business grants and loans kept our local economy going, and the District Council was superb in how they did that. But why then, as we head into a second wave, is the government hell-bent on pulling the plug on that support? On the 11th of March, the Chancellor promised to do whatever it takes, but the job support scheme incentivises keeping 1 employee on instead of 2. People working for businesses that are closed under local lockdowns will receive no more than 2/3 of their salaries, even on a minimum wage. Can you imagine? The minimum wage is no longer a minimum. The Winter Economy Plan offers no additional support for those businesses who are required to close. There is no support for those viable businesses severely hampered by the ongoing situation. There is still no answer to the calls of the 3 million taxpayers who have been largely excluded from financial support since the beginning of this crisis, and the offer to self-employed people of 20% of average monthly profits is miserly. Madam Deputy Speaker, you only have to look at the chart and data published by the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, an independent international body, that shows how the UK was the hardest hit of any major economy from April to June. Growth is slowing, and the economy is still 9% smaller than before the pandemic struck. Our unemployment rate has hit the highest level in over 3 years. Our young people have been hardest hit, but across our communities we know there are many more job losses to come. The number of claimants in my constituency is already up 135% since the start of this pandemic. Whole sectors have been flattened. Automotive manufacturing, which is so important to my constituency and many others, was brought to a standstill. It has had its worst September sales this century, and this is resulting in the UK industry facing massive financial pressure. But across the economy, from our assembly workers to our energy engineers, our brewers to our baristas, our dancers to our designers, all too many fear losing their jobs. But it didn't need to be this way. If we look at those countries who have had the strongest economies now, it is those countries that took clear early action to suppress and eradicate the virus. China, Taiwan, and other Asia-Pacific economies are on course to grow in 2020. They took early action to suppress COVID-19 to extremely low levels and put in place highly performing track and trace systems. The only consistency from this government was its inconsistency. Barbers could work, but beauticians couldn't. You could spend 4 hours alongside 300 people on an aeroplane, but not with 50 people on a coach or bus. The government had the whole summer to produce a plan for schools, a plan for universities, a plan for care homes, and most importantly, to fix, test and trace. It instead spent its time telling us to eat out, to help out, and it blew its budget. We could have eradicated this virus with a proper strategy, but the government dithered and delayed. It ignored the approaches from PPE manufacturers in my constituency. Businesses like Steger Clear Plastics in Coventry, Techman more locally to me. These were businesses that could have helped us through.